Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of the War Report. Now, there is quite a bit to cover, so we're just going to get right to it. Skip through any intro, skip through any filibustering, and go right to the frontline updates in Ukraine. Starting on August 1st, there's some more news about the F 16s that have been received. They have flown their first missions serving in an air defense capacity, according to the newspaper Telegraph, and that Peskov has said as a result of the F 16's arrivals, mind you, so far only 6 have been delivered with 3 trained pilots. Now we'll see going forward if more quote unquote volunteers from Western countries sign up to fly these things, because that is the only way I think they could really make a difference is if you get them there in significant numbers and you have a foreign legion of pilots in order to actually go toe to toe with the Russian Air Force. Otherwise, the Ukrainians simply are not capable of conducting these operations themselves. One would imagine that the training has been nowhere near sufficient, the potential language barrier on any hardware or software within the aircraft, and not to mention, you've had a lot of these Ukrainians being trained in the United States when a lot of the export F 16s, for example, like the ones that Ukraine has gotten from Denmark, they are, yes, the same aircraft, but there are intricacies with the export versions of the F 16. So we could be looking at profoundly undertrained pilots operating these things and not operating very many of them. And I don't know the number of Ukrainians who are currently in pilot training for the F 16, but I can't imagine that it is that many. And this endeavor ultimately seems like a very too little too late prospect. I'll reiterate what I had said last week, where a lot of this feels like the Pentagon is just trying to offload, or whichever military establishment in whatever Western country, whether that be the Danish, whether that be whoever, these countries are trying to offload the F 16s, maybe in hopes of getting F 35s. In my opinion, a bad trade deal. Knowing what we know about the F 35, you might be better off keeping the F 16s, but hey, who knows? I mean, hell, even Turkey wants the F 16s at this point, so I can't imagine that they're happy about watching these things get blown up in Ukraine, or going to be watching these things get blown up in Ukraine, because they're not going to fare well. I don't think anyone is under the illusion. Even the most hardcore pro-Ukraine supporters, I think, have given up on the idea that these things are going to be able to make any sort of significant difference. I mean, even in the past, the wonder weapons you've had, whether that be the HIMARS, whether that be the Javelins, whatever, those did make a difference. Those did plug certain gaps. But the F-16s, looking at the progress on the front line in the Donbass in particular, this makes no difference. They're not going to change the direction of the battle for New York, or Novgorodskoye, if you prefer, which, like I said, I'll get further into the news about that. It's a show. That's all this is. It's a show, and in my opinion, particularly for these European countries, it's a good offloading for them to convince the U.S. or whoever else, whatever other major arms manufacturing countries are in the West, whether it be the U.K., France, etc. So they can go to France, they can go to the U.S. and say, we want next-gen aircraft because we were generous enough to supply Ukraine with our aircraft. And that's really all it feels like. Much like what Poland did with its fleet of Soviet-era tanks, trying to get Tigers and Abrams in replacement. And those were some fierce negotiations. I don't think they ended up getting the one-for-one that they were wanting. And that's also a risk that a lot of these countries run, is they pawn off these last-gen aircraft in expectation of getting an equal number of current-gen aircraft, but looking at the arms industry in these countries, they might not see it that way. So we'll see how much of a difference the F-16s actually do make in Ukraine. I don't anticipate much, frankly. But moving on to some more substantial reports on the front line. According to the Russian Ministry of Defense, Ukraine has lost upwards of 13,570 soldiers, 14 tanks, 42 armored vehicles, 189 artillery pieces over the course of the past week. From the end of last week, once again we're talking July 26th to August 2nd. Take those numbers with a grain of salt. Of course, the Russian MOD are going to inflate these numbers. But I don't have a hard time believing that Ukrainian losses have been heavy with some of the progress, pardon the pun, on the front this week, which, like I said, I'll get into in just a moment here. The Russian MOD also reports that it had downed Ukraine MiG 29s and Su 25s, as well as hitting three launchers and radars of the Patriot missile systems that were deployed throughout the country. Moving on to just some brief updates on the front line, starting with some of the news out of the Zaporozhye front just over the past couple days here. There was no real advances in that regard. There has been some skirmishes, there have been some positional battles in Robotino and the surrounding areas, but like I said, nothing too significant. Most of the action right now is taking place in Chasov Yar, Toretsk, and the Pokrovsk direction, with some significant fighting in Volchansk. The Ukrainians have renewed their effort there to try to drive Russia out of the Kharkov Oblast, which, getting into some of their end of war plans, if we're to believe Zelensky's comments, I do think there is a. I don't want to attribute any sort of great strategy to the Ukrainians with how we've seen them perform in the past few months, so I'm not going to go that far. But just to go over some brief updates, there were some assault groups that were able to fight their way into some of the high-rise buildings in Volchansk, and they complete some of the clearing operations. The Ukrainians did make one attempt to counterattack, but they were discovered by recon units of the Russians and destroyed. So the Russians do continue to make progress in the Volchansk direction, although it's not to the rate on some of the other parts of the front line where it does seem that the AFU just is collapsing. And trust me, I have a whole litany of stories on just the breakdown of morale within the AFU that I have on the docket here. But it is one of the areas where the Ukrainians are putting up fierce resistance. That in Chasov Yar as well. Chasov Yar has been consistently putting up fierce resistance for the past several weeks now. But to move on from that, you did have in the Kupiansk direction the reported capture of strongholds in the Berestoye, Pechenoye direction. In Chasov Yar, you did finally get the Russian forces crossing the canal and capturing the first buildings on the other side of the canal, on the west side of the canal. In Toretsk, which is once again one of the other fiercer directions, it does seem like the Ukrainians have reoriented their strategy to hold the Russians back from taking Toretsk, that they have redirected a lot of their energy from other parts of the front line and have decided to make their stand in the Toretsk direction, where you do have the Russians advancing through the western parts of Zelizhone, with small assault groups making their way to the Central 330 power substation. In New York, or Novgorodskoye if you prefer, Russian forces are pressing the western part of the settlement, and in the western northern direction, bypassing the Filoni plant, where that has been the logistics hubs of the AFU. And, I mean, New York, Novgorodskoye has been a major logistics front in the Donbass front, and I'm sure you have all seen the images of Russian flags being raised over parts of the city and the Ukrainians being driven back. Like I said, that's probably one of the biggest updates this week, where you did see parts of Novgorodskoye continue to fall. Of course, Syrskyi refused to order a retreat until last minute, so there is still resistance being put up for the village. And like I said, major supply hub, not to downplay the significance here. And I don't know how long the clearing operations are going to take in the city, but we will continue to see how that does advance. So looking at some updates from Avdiivka, there has been fierce fighting in the village of Zelenoye, where Russian storm units have entered into the northeast and also the northwest outskirts along the railway. Ukrainians were surrounded in a number of positions and prisoners were taken. against the backlash, against the background of the MOD, the Russian MOD's confirmation of full control over Novosilovka. The Ukrainians are reporting that the expansion of the Russian zone of control is near the settlement. Moving once again to Zaporozhye, this is as of August 4th, August 5th. You did have positional battles continue, and it doesn't look like there's been much progress. However, there's been some encirclements of Ukrainian fighters and artillery units by Russian forces. In Kherson, once again, it's been slow, but it's been near Iloshki where they've been fighting for control of an apartment block, which did catch fire. There has been more attacks on the Belgorod region with Ukrainian shelling there. And like I said, we'll get into Kursk in just a few moments because I'm sure that's what everyone's clamoring to hear about. That's the biggest news out of the updates in Ukraine this week. But just to go once again briefly through some frontline updates here. Moving on to some news from Tuesday, August 6th, 2 days ago as of our time of recording. There have been Russian troops advancing east of Robotino up to 1.5 kilometers. Several Ukrainian positions have been taken. Also, you do have Russian troops that are active northwest of Bervoye, where Ukrainian positions have come under the control of the Russian forces. Moving on to some updates from Krasnogorovka, there has been clearing operations of the liberated section of the city, and fighting does continue on the outskirts where there are remnants of the Ukrainian garrisons. Ukrainian artillery is still actively working. Moving on to Karlovka and the Karlovskoye Reservoir, there hasn't been any significant changes. The Ukrainians are still holding out near the reservoir. As I had mentioned earlier, to continue on some updates from Zelenoye, there has been some tactical successes of the Russian forces. In New York, Novgorodskoye, there have been Russian forces continuing their offensive in the direction of Dzerzhinsk along the outskirts of the city, and that they are still fighting from one of the heights. Chasov Yar, no significant changes beyond the crossing of the canal, and you do have the Russians continuing to improve their position on the eastern part of the town and on the flanks of the town. So, uh, Chasov Yar, they're chipping away at. Where we saw Ukrainian fierce resistance even just a week ago, it does seem that a lot, as I had said earlier, a lot of the attention, a lot of the Ukrainian energy has been redirected to the Toretsk direction. And, I mean, we'll see the absolute waste of manpower and resources that a lot of these Operation Kursk cost because they removed units from Chasov Yar to engage in this offensive, if you want to call it that, in Kursk, which I think that even overstates it. Not to downplay the situation here, but moving on to some of the other news out of the front, some of the more up-to-date news as of the 7th or the 8th, which is the day I am recording this. Just briefly, you do have Ukrainian advances in the region of Kursk being prevented, uh, with particular artillery and air power being redirected towards it. But probably the other big news towards the front line, like I said, a lot in Toretsk seems to be the real sticking point of the Ukrainians right now, where they are redirecting all of their resources. In which case, in my opinion, Chasov Yar will suffer for it, and that they're seating around there. New York is more or less a lost cause at this point. I don't think there's much they can do to reverse their fortunes in the settlement, but I mean, I could be wrong. They could rush reserves there in order to hold it. Like I said, it's a major logistics hub, so it is one of the more vital positions to hold. It's not just one of these mounds of dirt that they insist on holding. But overall, in the country of Ukraine, there has been strikes all over. In particular, there was Russian strikes on Helmitsky, Kiev, and Nikolaev oblasts. Uh, the Ukrainians have, in kind, launched drone attacks on Vorozhne, which did hit residential buildings, and they continue to launch shells and missiles in the direction of Kursk and Kurchatov. And finally, just for brief frontline updates, like I said, I know they're a little bit all over the place, but just so much has happened in the past day here where you do have Ugledar, where the Russians have managed to gain a foothold on the outskirts of Konstantinovka, and they do continue to move west and north along the pond there. So, like I said, quite a bit happening in the front lines. Hopefully, that wasn't too out of order, but the past week has just been complete madness with this. Now, I do want to preface a lot of what I'm going to say about the operations in Kursk with some news regarding just the state of the Ukrainian armed forces. So, these are the men who have been ordered to push directly into Russian territory, which I do think, although carried out in a very stupid way, that in a very sacrificial way, I should say, it does serve a greater purpose when it comes to delaying the inevitable. But first, I just want to go over some of the breakdown morale happening within the Ukrainian armed forces. So, you have reports from the 79th Brigade of the Ukrainian armed forces. Once again, you have one of the men in the unit, or in the brigade, who is showing his face, not covering his face, making an open plea for demobilization because of the level of exhaustion that has taken hold in the soldiers in the brigade, that they're no longer able to fight effectively because the exhaustion has taken root so much, in that there hasn't been much recourse. Mind you, the troop rotation on the Ukrainian side has been terrible to say the least, and that their ability to swap out troops, you've had a lot of men who have been in the same position, who have been in active combat since the beginning of the Russian intervention into Ukraine on 24th February 2022, and have been in the same position since. And it seems like the only way out of the battlefield, seems like the only way off the front, is quite literally either on a stretcher or in a body bag. And that those are the only people that are evacuating, that the men are exhausted, supplies are short, both in terms of basic goods as well as ammunition, as well as what they actually need to fight in the war effort. To continue on that same note, there are the widows of missing Ukrainian soldiers asking for compensation from the state. They've started a petition in particular, and this is they're petitioning the 57th Brigade of the Ukrainian Armed Forces in particular, which does not take the bodies of the dead, and they're not returned to the families, so they are left in the front lines. And I mean, of course, they are buried, and you can see the cemeteries across Ukraine, but you aren't having the bodies returned for these dead men, and the families, particularly the widows, are asking for compensations. And because they don't have the bodies, they can't prove it, and it's dubious with the documentation. And you do get the phenomenon like you had in Afghanistan, a lot of ghost soldiers, so to speak, whenever there's casualties, whenever there's defections. Officers in these units will not report it because they still receive the pay for it, they still receive the supplies for it. They can cook their own books in order to make their personal position better on the front lines, or help for their wallets in that matter. In the Poltava Oblast, you have military enlistment and registration officials who are driving around with TCC on their cars, and like I said, you've all seen the vans. They're the TCC vans, and once again, those are also Cyrillic characters they do translate. But you do have a lot of people in a counter protest, even soldiers who, mind you, these are reservist soldiers. These are people who are in non-combat positions, the people who pay for a lot. And Poltava is not subject to active combat. It's pretty far behind the lines, where a lot of people in the city, even or in the oblast, even down to the soldiers, are putting that TCC logo on their car with a no sign over it, with the circle and a line through it. So you're getting more open forms of protest against the press gangers in places like Poltava, which I know is pretty core to contemporary Ukraine, but I believe has still a significant amount of Russophone population and a lot of people who would probably see themselves as Russian. Once again, it's part of the one of those parts of the country that does waffle back and forth. It is closer to the east, however, it still is within the orbit of Kiev enough to be drawn into that core modern Ukrainian identity. You also have the same breakdown of morale with a lot of mercenaries who have been drawn into the conflict. So, to quote or paraphrase one of the Spanish mercenaries that was interviewed with the Spanish publication El Español, I came to fight, not to throw my life, says a Spanish mercenary who refused to go into battle, realizing that the Russians might kill him. So, once again, how much of this is he was ordered to go on a mission that he simply would not survive, and how much of this is him realizing the reality of war and backing down when he realized the circumstance. Now, once again, given the state of the Ukrainian war effort, I can't blame him at all for what he did right here. But to give more detail about him, he was a 50-year-old man. Apparently, his nickname on the front, and the only name that they've given us, is Nacho, from Alicante, Spain, lives in a campsite without drinking water and with expired food. He was transferred there by the 241st Brigade to the AFU after dismissal more than 2 months ago, and Ukrainian territorial defenses does not allow him to terminate his contract, despite his right to retire, and he says he's been without salary and without a resolution to his situation for 3 months, so you do get a lot of these foreign volunteers go over there. I know that, in particular, Colombians, a lot of Colombian volunteers have been drawn into the Ukrainian conflict, and they report much the same. There were clashes between Colombian mercenaries and their commanders in other Ukrainian units because they were ordering them, of course, to go into the missions with little to no chance of survival, as one does with these foreign mercenaries. And there was actually exchanges between them because of that, and quite violent exchanges. So you are getting the breakdown of morale of a lot of the units here. Now, we've come a long way since the start of the war, when a lot of these volunteers were posting on Reddit, and the Russians were able to geolocate their bases and launch pretty effective strikes on volunteer positions in Ukraine, which madness that ever came to that point in the first place, but it looks like that situation, I mean, those are old stories. This was like 2 years ago. But it does look like a lot of the people who didn't know what they were getting into when it came to their position in Ukraine, when it came to their position on the front line, are now having to come to reality with the situation. On that note as well, you have reported by the AFU 30,000 cases of desertion since the beginning of the year in 2024. On the whole, for 2023, for comparison, there were about 24,000 cases, and moving on to 2022, there was only about 9.4 thousand cases. However, you have to keep in mind, naturally, reported cases are going to be much lower than actual instances of it. Like I said, a lot of it goes down to the situation of ghost soldiers, where the officers in the units, the officers in charge of the soldiers, do have an incentive to overreport their numbers for more supplies, for more resources, for even more money that they are supposed to pay to their men. And a lot of the pay structure, to my understanding, does passed down the chain, and it's reliant on, I suppose you could say, a lot of the people throughout the chain of command acting in good faith and not embezzling the money. But we've seen what happens in a lot of cases. I mean, I think Afghanistan is the prime example. I don't think this is nearly as bad as Afghanistan, but at this point, who knows? And there's some claims that it's about 3 or 4 times as much in terms of number of deserters than what is reported, which means we could be looking at potentially 120,000 deserters within the first 6 months of this year. I would have a hard time believing that much. But mind you, there's been far more draft dodgers and immigrants and people who have left the country. So this is according to one of the deputies of the Rada, Natalia Luka is her name, and there has been about 800,000 Ukrainians who are eligible for military service who, quote-unquote, went into the shadow to hide from mobilization. Now, Nataluka is chair of the Committee on Economic Development and reports that Ukrainians are hiding from the aforementioned TCC in their place of residence and trying to get paid under the table in order to avoid that. Now, there has been concerns about mobilization and about the effects on the economy where the Ukrainians have really put themselves in a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation because they forced a lot of these men to go in the shadows, as Nataluka had said. And, of course, getting paid like that, nothing on the record. They're not paying their taxes, so the Ukrainian state's being deprived of revenue that way. And they're also not under arms, so they're not able to be used as cannon fodder in the next absurd offensive. So these men, for all intents and purposes, do not exist. They're not contributing anything to Ukraine. Like, once again, I don't fault them given the current circumstances. I would probably do the same in their shoes, but it's a position where, no, they're not collecting anything on these men. They still need them to work a lot of vital jobs, particularly in manufacturing, because Ukraine still does have some small war industry, and also in logistics as well on the civilian side. A lot of the vital jobs that still need to take place during wartime just to keep a country functional, those still need to be done, and they can't afford to uproot those men and put them under arms. Now, who knows, maybe we'll get a bunch of guest workers. Maybe that's why Modi is going to visit India. Modi is going to visit from India to Ukraine at the end of the month to sell Ukraine on guest workers, as Indians tend to do abroad. I mean, that'd be quite the pivot from India's previous position in this war, right? I suppose you can play both sides, all the better. I'm kidding, of course. But who knows, Ukraine might consider that as an option, inviting in guest workers. Now, who the hell would want to go to Ukraine as a guest worker? It beats me. I don't know. Maybe people view it as a gateway to Europe and a chance to go west, end up in Ukraine, go west. Now, I think they're in for a sore surprise once they find that. I can imagine that the Ukrainians, if they were to implement a guest worker program, would be just as stringent, if not more, than the Gulf states in terms of passport confiscation. It would be effectively a form of slavery. I can't think of anyone in their right mind to be a guest worker in Ukraine. But the point being is, you have almost 1 million Ukrainian men who have been forced into the shadows and, for all intents and purposes, are not contributing to the armed forces, are not contributing as a tax base, and are depriving their country that way. And like I said, I'm not sitting here and wagging my finger and morally condemning them for doing such because of the current state of the Ukrainian nation. I really can't blame them. But Kiev, once again, the government in Kiev has shot itself in the foot more than I think one could possibly imagine. A report from a Ukrainian military chaplain gives us more of an insight on the Ukrainian armed forces. So he reports, Sergeyev is his surname, that there are female service members of the AFU on the front line who are engaging in indiscriminate sex with their fellow soldiers, after which they become pregnant and leave the combat zone. His words, not mine. And I quote, Well, seriously, such madness is happening. Just imagine a girl 24 years old, model-like appearance, she's a medic, and she's in a company of special operations forces. They're pumped up, muscle-bound, and so they take all the turns with her in bed. It's just trash. That's how they live, and that's how she gets pregnant and takes a timeout, Sergeyev says. According to him, the situation could be changed by female chaplains, of whom there are few. I guess that would be the case, but I still think it doesn't address the underlying problem of. I mean, of course, you're going to have women in auxiliary roles, even on the front lines. That's just a reality of war that's been that way for a number of centuries now. But it does get down to a much deeper problem that I think would require much more than that. But I mean, who knows? But moving on to some protests that were actually took place in the Rivne region, which is in western Ukraine. There has been mass protest against the work of military commissars. Apparently, there was a harsh detention, beating at a checkpoint of two young boys who were not even 18 years old, and now the people are demanding that the commissars be detained and stripped of their rank for their actions. And I have no doubt. And look, that does bring up another question. A lot of Ukrainian men who are probably under conscription age have been illegally conscripted anyway, if we're being honest, because it's officially 25. I know the Rada lowered it to 25 earlier this year. But, I mean, if they're going to go after boys who are under 18, if we're to believe the story, which I have no reason to disbelieve it, you think they aren't abducting 18 or 21-year-olds who could just look 25, or hell, they don't even have to look that way, and press ganging them into service? I think that's an overlooked factor in all of this, the fact that there are probably a lot of men who have been, at least under the conditions of Ukrainian law, have been illegally conscripted in this conflict. I would have no doubt of that. And I do think that they will continue to do this, that they will disregard any sort of age restrictions and throw these men into battle. I know that the official average age on the front line is 43 years old, but like I said, the TCC, the Ukrainian state, has proven themselves to have done, in my opinion, much more shameless things. So I have no reason to believe that this would be any sort of exception, that this would be the absolute red line in terms of their morality, in terms of what they're unwilling to do. And I have no reason to believe that. And on top of all of this, Syrskyi is quickly losing popularity among the armed forces. Not that he was ever greatly popular, he was never close to the level of Zaluzhny. Now, according to the Russian Telegram channel Resident, citing sources in the general staff, Syrskyi adheres to a strategy of holding settlements to the last and forbids ordering a retreat. General 200, which is the radio code the Ukrainians use for KIA, does not defend the military at the rate, but agrees with any position of the politicians. Decisions on retreat are made independently by combat commanders. So you do have a lot of combat commanders who are breaking rank with Syrskyi, and for the sake of their survival and their men's survival, telling them to get the hell out of there. And that's where you've seen a lot of these settlements fall. And I don't know if there's been any sort of court-martials in Ukraine because of this. I wouldn't put it past the Ukrainian state or Syrskyi to try to prosecute these men and prosecute these lower-level commanders for doing the right thing, both tactically and morally speaking, and getting the hell out of an unwinnable situation. And Syrskyi, he's been taking flack from his subordinates, from the Rada. Pretty much the only person who has not turned his claws on Syrskyi is Zelensky, which it's only a matter of time, really, before Zelensky decides to throw him under the bus. Now, I know that the overthrow of Zaluzhny and the removal of Zaluzhny was because of popularity concerns, that he feared he would be able to form a united front and actually challenge his position of power, but Syrskyi, General 200, doesn't command that sort of respect or admiration from his troops. He's perfect. And he'll march the men in the slaughter. They couldn't give less of a damn about the Ukrainian lives. I mean, there's a very real case that Russian commanders actually give more of a damn about Ukrainian troops than their own commanders. And as the joke went, I wish I remember who I could give credit to, but by the time this is all said and done, Siersky is going to get the Hero of the Russian Federation medal for his work in the war effort towards Russia. If one didn't know any better, they would say this man is subversive. He is a saboteur. Mind you, that he is an opportunistic man who failed out of his military career in Russia, which is the entire reason he's in Ukraine. He was just slightly too incompetent to have been one of the Russian MOD staff who was arrested or purged a few months ago when you had the cabinet shuffle in Russia. Look, if a few things went differently in Siersky's life, he would have been among those career officers in Russia who were just forced to resign or even arrested on corruption charges. But the only difference is he had the foresight to escape to Ukraine and claw his position up a bit further in a weaker country. Uh, the last piece I'll include pertains to both Israel and Ukraine, where at this point now both nations have banned Telegram. I guess the free flow of information is too much of a threat to what is clearly the true and moral case. And once again, I'm not saying this is some sort of principled free speech absolutist. I think we've all accepted that there's always some limit, whether it be legal or social or whatever. But I mean, it is interesting to see held to their own standards that the man Telegram, and I think it's also quite telling that they have to shut down this information with how dire it is for them. That there really is no way out, and that this is their only recourse is to try to completely cut their men off from information. You might just say that's the name of the game when it comes to soldiers. You can't allow demoralizing propaganda to spread, but the fact that there is that much demoralizing propaganda in the first place, I think, just doesn't bode well in general. So, once again, we'll see what comes of that. It's not that big of a story, but I thought it was interesting nonetheless. And the final demoralization story I have before I move on to the news out of Sumy and Kursk is some news from BlackRock. And a representative of BlackRock visited Kiev recently and requested soldiers no longer be buried on ground that BlackRock owns in Ukraine. Now, mind you, at this point they own up to 47% of Ukrainian land, and they asked this land not be used for burials and that bodies can be either cremated or disposed of in other ways, where these men will be marched to their deaths for the supposed glory of the Ukrainian nation, but cannot be buried in their own soil, and must be turned to ash, quite literally. And that's the request of the new overlords of Ukraine. And sure, say what you will about Russia, but nobody, in my opinion, despises the Ukrainian population more than its own masters, whether that be Siersky, whether that be Zelensky, of course, whether that be these Western financiers or these other corporate or foreign interests who intervene in Ukraine. They've done far harsher things, in my opinion, to the Ukrainian populace than I think even most Russians could have dreamed of at this point. And that if there was any desire for immense Russian cruelty for whatever the cause may be, if the Russians did decide to wage total war, an unapologetic war, they would take after these people. I mean, mind you, that not to sing the praises of the Russians too much, I know that they're a country like any other, that of course there's plenty of things you can say about them. They're not morally immune to any of this stuff. But they've buried Ukrainian forces with full honors. They've given them marked graves. And they've laid them to rest properly, as, once again, armies have historically done. That there is some degree of mutual respect between enemy armies where they will do that for their fallen enemy. But if you're Ukrainian and you just so happen to be from an area where BlackRock has major land holdings, you have to be turned to ashes or thrown in the Black Sea. And this is the nation that they're being press-ganged into fighting for. This is the nation that they're supposed to throw their lives and livelihoods away for. And this is why 800,000 men who are eligible for service have dodged. This is why 30,000 to 120,000 men just this year have deserted the army. This is not a nation, and they're seeing it. This is not a nation they want to fight and die for. This is not what they want to throw away their lives for. They would rather be a foreigner in Western land, and hell, even Russia in some of their cases, than continuing to live on to be cattle for these people. There's really no other way to put it. And it's, there's been a lot of terrible things that have happened in this war, but this is just the worst. And it's actually Fennec Writer on Twitter, if you're interested, will go through periodically and has a massive thread on his account of cemeteries throughout Ukraine. And truthfully, out of everything I've seen this war, it's probably, I don't know the word for it, but makes me feel the least comfortable, most stomach turning out of anything I've seen in this war. Just how these cemeteries seem to exponentially multiply, uh, with men of all walks of life, and this nation is being depopulated in real time. And what will be done with this land? I know. Look, I know BlackRock is one of those concentrations of, let's just say, anger from people who are disgruntled. It's like anger towards the WEF, where yes, these people are bad. Yes, we hold no common ground with them, but they are put out in the forefront to take the flak for a lot of what's going on behind the scenes. And like I said, they deserve it. They deserve criticism. But in many ways, a lot of these groups, a lot of these organizations exist to absorb the criticism so it doesn't get expanded into other things. Like the IMF, for example, which has played a very large role in this, where they, like I said, they're there to absorb the blows, deserving of criticism, but they become the target of criticism rather than one of many. And but once again, we're talking about a group that apparently owns 47% of Ukrainian land. And what are they going to do with this land? Who's going to get to settle on it? Who are the new Ukrainians going to be? Is Ukraine going to be subject to mass migration? There's a lot of questions here. And I suppose time will tell, but even in the event of a miracle, even in the event of the situation reversing somehow for Ukraine in a military sense, there's nothing left to go home to. What are you going to rebuild? You can rebuild buildings. You can recultivate land. You can repair damage to the inanimate. But to repopulate a nation, to rebuild a nation's people, takes decades, takes generations. And that's on top of, first and foremost, predominantly the men, the fighting age men who have died, who otherwise would have been working jobs that are the backbone of society, whether that be some sort of blue collar labor, whether that be in some sort of more technically skilled position. But once again, the people who really build and maintain the quite literal infrastructure of any nation, any society, a lot of those men have just been killed. But even in a secondary effect, think about all the people who have left, who have made new lives in other parts of Europe, in Russia, in North America, whether it be the U.S., Canada, or wherever, who, especially compared to a lot of other migrant groups, do assimilate relatively well, and in a few generations probably will reflect the core culture. Now, what those core cultures will look like in a few generations, I suppose it's a pivotal question. We have a lot of news to cover in the UK as well, with that I think will touch on that question. But point being is, how many of these people will return to the Ukraine? How many of these people in 3 generations will remember they're Ukrainian? How much will assimilation take place? What can a post-war Ukrainian government, even under the best of circumstances, even the restoration of 1991 borders and full reparations from Russia, even with all of that, what is there going to be the rebuild of Ukraine? What incentives are they going to put down in order to draw the people who had fled Ukraine back? I don't know, is Ukraine going... Are we going to see those schizophrenic conspiracy theories come true, where Ukraine really is the second Israel? And that's why there's these machinations in the Middle East that they're going to up and abandon Palestine and move to Ukraine instead? Is that what we're seeing? I don't think so, but the chain of events lends itself to that kind of let's just say, more out there thinking. In which case, you can't even blame them for coming up with those ideas. But moving on to the supposed idea of peace, you have Zelensky over this past week teasing the idea of peace, talking about how there's going to need to be peace talks before the end of the war, of course, and that we're going to need to see some sort of progress with that, and that we can't expect this war to go on in 2025. Blah, 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 blah. All these empty overtures that he always does, but like I said, they're intensifying. And this could just be A/B testing. I know that a majority of Ukrainians now report, up from plurality, but a majority of Ukrainians now report. I think up to the latest survey, it was upwards of 57% said that it's time for some sort of brokered peace. Whether that be in terms of negotiating right now or making the situation more favorable for Ukraine than negotiating. But point being is, around 57% of Ukrainians surveyed now are in support of some sort of negotiated peace. The situation has just gotten too out of hand. It's just gone on this long. So Zelensky is teasing those ideas, which goes on to some of the recent news with Kursk. Now, I will start that over the past couple weeks, the Russians have been amassing forces near the Sumy Oblast on the border of Russia, which is actually on the border of Kursk Oblast on the Russian side, in order for an offensive. Now, it's heavily mined that has been what has prevented a major Russian offensive. There were some initial incursions into Sumy early on in the war, but as we saw with some of the retreats, especially post Istanbul deal falling through, no real progress had been made on Sumy at that point. And with that, you had the Russians amassing forces in order to punch in the Sumy, in order to demine the area and to open up yet another front, while Ukrainian defenses on the Donbass, in particular, are faltering. And some say it was also an operation to support a potential Kharkov offensive, both of which I think are reasonable. But the Ukrainians came in on August 6th and had a surprise attack that really took everyone off guard, or at least everyone claims to have been taken off guard. Now, insofar as the position of the Western partners, where the U.S. said, we had no idea about this. For all we know, that's a lie. I mean, this is an area where the Ukrainians do have permission to use the long-range weapons. These are parts of Russia where they do have permission to use the long-range missiles. That the Pentagon was suddenly taken aback by this Ukrainian plan, which, like I said, I'll go over some of the theories and go over what I think personally when it comes to what happened here. Either the Pentagon is far more incompetent than I had ever realized, or they're lying through their teeth. Or maybe a little bit of both. I don't know. And it does become harder to gauge that with how many blunders we've seen out of the American administrative state, especially in the past 4 years. Not just the past 4 years, but especially in the past 4 years, and at the end of the Trump administration going into Biden. They've surprised me in many ways, virtually all of which have been profoundly negative. And I have to admit, either way here, it wouldn't be a surprise. So, some speculate that this is a last-ditch effort in terms of the Ukrainian war effort. That Ukraine, looking at the situation on the front line, looking at the morale, looking at the resources and manpower they have left to fight this war, are realizing it's done. It's over. We've lost to some degree, but if we can punch in, if we can bloody Russia's nose just one more time, we can go into bargaining, we can go into negotiations with a little bit of an upper hand, with just a little bit more bargaining power. If we can just take some territory, if we can just capture some villages, it's a done deal. We can make territory exchanges and soften the blow against Ukraine in terms of territorial losses. Fair enough, that's a reasonable enough take. But given what we've seen with the Ukrainian positions in there so far, and who knows what this operation will end up bringing, who knows what the end result of this operation will actually look like, by the time everything is said and done. It doesn't look like they're making much effort to actually secure these territories in securing supply lines to them. And in terms of occupation, it doesn't seem as if they're garrisoning any of these captured settlements. I believe it's up to 11 settlements that the Russian Ministry of Defense has reported captured. In terms of actually securing these settlements and securing control of them with their troops, with their supply lines, so far, to my analysis, I haven't seen anything that would suggest they're really entrenching here. And then the next speculated point is the Kursk nuclear power plant, and that they're trying to capture that and use that as some sort of leverage to draw the Russians out of the Zaporozhye power plant, which has been a site of contention since March of 2022, since almost the beginning of this war. Now, mind you, that's 70 kilometers deep in the border, in the Kursk Oblast, that the supply lines, in order to, once again, advance 70 kilometers from Ukraine proper into Kursk to capture a power plant, I don't know, unless this is just some sort of one-way mission raiding party. They take that, they move in, and then they have the power plant, and then they exchange with some sort of blackmail. For example, them threatening to destroy it if the Russians don't concede to whatever ridiculous demand. I have a hard time believing that with how far away it is, unless this really is some sort of very desperate last-ditch effort. Now, another one is just across the border, and you did have Ukrainians moving into position with this. One of the gas hubs, particularly connected to the Druzhba pipeline, which has been the site of contention between Ukraine, Hungary, and Slovakia, is through Kursk. Now, at that point, what are they going to do? Because they've already cut off oil transit through the Druzhba pipeline into Hungary and Slovakia, which has led to this current row between them, which has soured already contentious relations even further. Are they going to destroy the gas infrastructure? I mean, at that point, it would, number one, be harming them in terms of cutting off any sort of transit fees that would go to them, and also giving up any sort of bargaining power. And I would have to believe that, once again, any sort of pipeline demolition would have to be the job of the US, the UK, or some other proxy, like we saw with Nord Stream, because even with how much sabers are drawn against Russia, even with how much resentment is drawn against Russia, they do realize their position when it comes to how much of a pipeline hub they are, when it comes to how much energy flows through Ukraine, and the transit fees that they get paid for that. So they can't destroy that with no consequences, unless the plan is they want to make the Russian state spend billions on repairs because they aren't transiting energy to the pipeline anyway. Maybe just one last spiteful move towards the renegade European Union states that refuse to stand with Ukraine 100%. The other theory that I think becomes a bit more realistic, and I don't think any of these are necessarily mutually exclusive. I think some of these are less likely, but a lot of these aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. And one that I think is certainly the case no matter what is going on is revenge, is lashing out against the Russian population. One of the first reports of the Ukrainian incursions into the Kursk Oblast, and one of the first villages they moved in. One of the first casualties was a civilian. They opened fire on a civilian car with a family. The woman was 24. There was a 2-year-old boy, and I think the man was 25, 26. Woman was pregnant, mind you. And they shot up the car. Woman died. The father and the son were injured and hospitalized, taken to a hospital position, once again, much further within the oblast. And that there's been stories of these sort of reprisals against, of course, ethnic Russians that have been occurring throughout this. So, regardless of whatever else, you have the mindset of a lot of these Ukrainians who, you look at their reactions to being sent into Kursk, a lot of them are questioning the rationale for this, questioning what's going on. But I suppose if you're going to get sent there, you're going to carry out ethnic grudges the best you can. The other major thing I will note is that, according to the Russian border guards, they allegedly heard Polish and French speaking troops among the Ukrainians, which, given how many foreign volunteers, once again, are in the AFU, especially from Poland and France, that is not a surprise at all. And getting into the actual details of what happened when it came to the incursions into Kursk was the borders were under the patrol of conscripts, under men fulfilling their military service obligation. And given the laws of the Russian Federation, the men who are drawn into their mandatory service are not put into foreign combat zones. They staff the other parts of the military, whether that be some sort of domestic duty, whether that be whatever else, and that you don't get men who deploy abroad until they sign on further with the Russian armed forces. And that's actually where you've gotten a lot of the increase in manpower, where you'll have these men who complete their mandatory military service, which is 12 months, I believe, now. I think they cut it down from 18 a few years ago. And because of just the culture that they're surrounded with, because of the people that they know, they are talked into signing up for a full contract with the Russian Ministry of Defense and going into Ukraine. But these are the men who were stationed with the home front. So they're less well equipped, they're less well trained, they're probably younger, they're probably, once again, those conscripts on their 12-month duty, and they got overrun by much more substantial Ukrainian forces as well as allies. So, taking a look at the situation, the morning of August 6th, Ukrainian units attempted an offensive in the Kursk region. At the moment, main events were unfolding in Sudzhansky and Koronevsky districts in the Kursk Oblast. Information about the attack was confirmed by the acting head of the region of Kursk, Alexei Smirnov. At night, the AFU carried out strikes across Kursk, launching at least 26 drones. Most of the strikes were in the village of Shuja, where 5 civilians were injured, including 3 children. Footage of the severe destruction of residential buildings was circulating online. Later, Ukrainian formations launched attacks in several areas. In the Koronevsky district, Ukrainians began moving towards Vladimirovka in the direction of Gordievka. In the Sudansky district, the Ukrainians launched an offensive in the direction of the Suja village near the Gluboke track. And the main thrust of the Ukrainian forces was aimed at Gorchorovka and Kurilkovka. According to information from Ukraine that the Russians intercepted, it was along the 38K004 highway, where at least 3 Ukrainian tanks and group of infantry were spotted near the Suja checkpoint, and several armored vehicles were destroyed. And another direction of attack was Nikolaevko, Dorino, and Sverdlikovo. According to preliminary information that came out that day on the 6th, battles were taking place along the outskirts of populated areas. Armored vehicles of the AFU with new tactical identification marks in the form of a triangle were spotted in the area. The Ukrainian media reported what was happening and presented diametrically opposed positions. While some had called it an offensive, others called it a psychological operation on the part of the Russian authorities. Others, of course, exaggerated the successes of the Ukrainians, talking about the beginning of the fighting and that the Ukrainians had seized Suzhda in short order. And this is against the backdrop to the Ukrainian attacks. You have several Russian media outlets reporting in the night and early morning that Russian drone operators noticed a concentration of enemy forces along the border, but due to bureaucratic red tape and fear of making a decision, nobody gave the order to fire. However, Ukrainian offensive in the Kursk region is... We've seen these cross-border raids before, and Belgorod was one of the main targets of these, and that's part of why you got the recent operations by the Russians in the Kharkov region in order to build up some sort of buffer near Belgorod, which is still being shelled, but once again, they're not being hit as hard as they used to. We've seen the hits on civilian buildings in Belgorod. Pretty gruesome stuff, but like I said, this is part of the same sort of operation that we have seen time and time again. Yet this is bigger than what we've seen before, and this seems to be lasting longer, where the Ukrainians are really, once again, they are moving positions from the front lines to partake in this offensive, which even some of the most hardline pro-Ukraine shields were questioning the logic and the wisdom of this decision. And some might say it was so unexpected because it was so stupid. What point is there? That you have Novgorodskoye falling, you have the Russians making advances in Chasiv Yar, you have Volchansk, where the Ukrainians are trying to make some sort of breakthrough and push the Russians out of the Kharkov Oblast with the foothold that they have there. Uh, you have the deteriorating situation on the southern front, where the Ukrainians have wasted so much manpower trying to cross the Dnieper River in Kherson. You have the alleged 90,000 Russian troops in Zaporozhye that are going to launch a major offensive on Zaporozhye city, yet they're directing so many Ukrainian troops to push into Kursk, which, like I said, there's a lot of reasons. Personally, I think I'll just say it right now. They want to redirect the Russian forces that are amassing to launch an offensive on Sumy, which the response to this, although these Ukrainians are going to get driven out, how long it's going to take, I don't know. But although the Ukrainians have accepted that this offensive is not going to succeed, that they're not going to actually secure control of any Russian territory, they are going to delay the offensive in Sumy for a number of weeks, if not months at this point. And that ultimately it accomplished its goal in that regard, where the Russian progress is delayed, and it gives them more time to fortify Sumy. I know that, once again, when it came to mining the border, Sumy has been one of the areas where you've had the heaviest mining in Ukraine, and it gives them time to rush more equipment, rush more forces there. But the question is, how many forces are they willing to throw away with this? I mean, I know you had some people who were describing this as major columns, even though, once again, there's no real photo evidence to suggest that. There has been quite a bit of an incursion. There have been armored vehicles. There has been tanks, but this isn't a big aero offensive, so to speak. Insane nonetheless, but it's not a big aero offensive. So continuing on with some more news reports out of the Kursk Oblast from the situation that had developed throughout the day. Once again, this took place about 2 days ago, starting on the 6th of August. I'm recording on the night of the 8th of August. This will be out 9th of August is the earliest you will hear this. So keep that in mind if any of the information goes stale, if any of the information comes out to be proven wrong, whatever. This is the time and place I'm reporting from. So, moving on from that, according to the generalized data of all the sources, Ukrainian forces concentrated for the invasion amounted to several thousand people, including artillerymen and drone operators from Sumy, dozens of armored vehicles, a couple of surface-to-air missile systems, several DRGs with manpads that were ambushing Russian air power, particularly in helicopters. There were some helicopters on the Russian side that were shut down, and even had some of the more elite forces with Bradleys that were allocated for the incursion in the Kursk, and that there was a large degree of electronic warfare. There was a lot of DDoSing that cut Ukraine off, the Ukrainians cut the Russians in Kursk off from internet access, and also jammed communication as much as they could. And we saw this similarly in the attacks in Belgorod earlier in the year. Now, mind you, when I first heard about this, I assumed it was one of those quote-unquote free Russian legions, like the ones who did the attacks in Belgorod. But no, this is the AFU copying that they were directly involved in this. This was a direct operation ordered from Kiev. This isn't some sort of pro-Ukrainian rogue group that is attacking on their own volition in order to support the Ukrainian war effort. No, the Ukrainians are dedicating forces to this. And it was not unexpected from the Russian side. Apparently, at least Russian intelligence is doing some sort of damage control, claiming that they reported the accumulation of forces and equipment I just suppose with that, once again, nobody expected this to be an offensive. They expected this to be shoring up the forces to defend Sumy, which was probably imminently going to be attacked. We're talking within the next few weeks was going to fall to another Russian offensive that you would have Russian breakthroughs in Sumy once they had their forces amassed. And like I said, what this does, the biggest thing this accomplishes for Ukraine is that it draws those forces away. It makes the Russian state look weaker. It makes the Ukrainian state look stronger, which of course is good when it comes to donors and backers. They can point to this. And like I said, who knows what will happen with the Sumy offensive now that the Russians have to. And it's going to be those first forces that they divert because those are the closest ones. Those are the ones that were preparing for a battle in this region anyway. So and I know the Russians have the manpower advantage, they have the equipment advantage, but in terms of rushing these forces to the front, that takes time. It takes time to get these men trained, it takes time to get this equipment together in order to actually amass these forces in order to conduct these offensives. So that has been drawn out, and these forces that were supposed to be going on offensive now are going to be put on the defensive. And continuing on with just some of the general reports of it. So, as of this evening, Thursday evening, the key updates we have is that the Ukrainians advances has been halted and that there's been strikes by Russian air and artillery on AFU personnel, according to the Ministry of Defense. Over the past 24 hours, the AFU had lost up to 400 personnel, 32 armored vehicles in the Kursk region since the start of hostilities in the area, and they have lost 660 personnel and 82 armored vehicles in total, once again, according to the Russian MOD. The Russian MOD had published videos of the destruction of Ukrainian equipment throughout the oblast. Putin held a video conference with Smirnov, the acting governor, in which a decision was made to provide a one-term payment of 10,000 rubles to residents who had left their homes. And at this point, you had most of the residents of the bordering villages and most of the residents who were in the zone of combat evacuate further into the oblast. So, fortunately, a lot of civilians have escaped because, once again, we've gotten a small picture of what the Ukrainians plan on doing to a lot of the civilians there, what a lot of the Ukrainian forces will do to a lot of civilians there, with the case of that one young family that was just right across the border. So right now there's been 21 temporary accommodations set up in the Kursk region for those who have been evacuated, with approximately 3,000 people being evacuated from border areas. Almost all Russian regions are providing assistance in evacuating residents from the border areas, according to Smirnov, who once again is acting head of the region. Train stations in Sudzha, Koronevko, and Psel in the Kursk region have been temporarily closed to passengers, according to the Moscow railway system. And as I'd mentioned before, there was a DDoS attack, but services reportedly have been restored. And like I said, we'll see what comes of this. In my opinion, this is a lot of egg on the face of the Russians. Now, some may have said that about the 2022 counteroffensive. Some may have said that about the attacks in the Volgorod, which, once again, those were not good looks for the Russians, but they did manage to recover. And I guess if we want to put on our tinfoil hat, some of the speculations, which I don't necessarily believe, but once again, not to act like the Russian state is some morally cut above the rest compared to most contemporary states or states in general. I do think that they act in their people's interests for a significant amount of what they do. Of course, there are some subversive elements, there are some serving elements as exist in every country, but some speculate this to a degree was allowed to happen in order to justify another mobilization wave, in order to make the war feel closer to home for the Russian people, who have largely lived outside of the war. Aside from the occasional strike, aside from, like I said, the activity in Belgorod, most Russians, aside from maybe their wallets, aside from some of the economic hardship, which has been offset by Russian economic growth, at least from what I've seen, have not felt the effects of this war. And now that the war has punched into Kursk proper, into Russia proper, they may feel it as being closer to home. They may feel this as the war becoming a more urgent matter for them in their daily lives. In which case, they would be more amenable to another wave of conscription, which we haven't seen since September 2022. It's been almost 2 years since the last wave of mobilization. And I don't know if that actually is going to come. I don't think the Russians allowed this to happen, at least in that sense. And they may have underestimated the Ukrainians. They may have just assumed that these forces were amassing in order to defend Sumy. But like I said, nobody really saw this, in my opinion, because what purpose does it serve rationally? Especially when the front line on the Donbass is piece by piece falling, and that the Ukrainians are getting pushed back further and further. And like I said, they redirected troops from the front line in order to conduct this offensive. Now, some say this diverts Russian air power, this makes them pull their aircraft to defend their home territory, their home turf, whatever. But point being is, there had to be an understanding, at least I would think, in Kiev, that this operation would not end in a conventional victory. That this would be serving a greater purpose, that a lot of these men would have to be sacrificed. Now, allegedly, in some of the counterattacks, they have taken Ukrainian prisoners, but assuming, from what I've seen, that they haven't secured their supply lines, that they haven't tamped down all of this, they're going to need to push further. They're going to need to put up a more secure supply line if they want to continue having an impact. Because, like I said, embarrassing for Russia, but ultimately they can recover. But looking at the way they've structured their attack right now, these men are going to be sitting ducks in a matter of a week, depending on how long this continues, maybe 72 hours. And I know it's the big 72-hour rule to see what really comes of all of this. But assuming they either A, don't have a plan to secure their territory that they've captured or have made incursions into, or have a solid plan for retreat, which, I mean, the Ukrainian army retreating, I've never heard of such a thing, judging on some of the situations on the front line of the Donbass. These men are sitting ducks, and they're going to be taken prisoner, and who knows, maybe the goal was to raid in, take conscripts prisoners, and use them as part of a negotiating tactic by keeping them as prisoners of war. That could very well be the case. But like I said, unless there is a solid escape plan, more so you're going to get Ukrainian forces who are trapped behind enemy lines. You're going to get this Western equipment trapped behind enemy lines, and it's not really going to accomplish anything except looking like a good PR stunt. Now, I think it was more than a PR stunt, like I said. It's going to delay some offensives. It's going to force some diversions on the front line from the Russians, which, who knows, maybe will allow them to shore up their defenses. But, I mean, just look at the first 48 hours of the attack right now, where you have continual Russian progress on the front line right now. That it has not halted any Russian offensives, that, or ongoing Russian offensives, I should say. It probably has halted Sumy, but in terms of the bulk of the fighting, the situation on the front line remains unchanged as a result of these raids. In which case, in my opinion, this is only going to end in disaster for Ukraine. They may have scored some points in terms of PR. They may have even taken a few POWs they can use for bargaining power, and they may get to exact some sort of ethnic revenge fantasy on some of the civilians there. But ultimately, it's going to be a losing prospect, and I don't think Zelensky's going to really gain any bargaining power from this. They're not going to be able to secure any villages. And eventually, the Russians will drive them out, and I think it will be probably in pretty short order if the Ukrainians don't retreat first. And who knows, they might retreat and they might just call this a raid and say, we've been successful, we got what we wanted, we punched the heart of Russia, etc., 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 and it could blow over like that. But I don't know. I think the Ukrainians are, at this point, desperate enough to continue to make these less than rational moves and continue on with whatever the plan is. And if we're to believe Zelensky's talk about peace, once again, you have his comments about potential peace talks, and you have this, which don't square for most people. And even if you want to make the argument that this is some sort of bargaining tactic, it still doesn't square for most people. And the Russians, even assuming the Ukrainians could mount a successful offensive into Russia proper, they have a lot more territory than they concede than Kursk in order to sustain this war effort. And every time you get these Ukrainian terror tactics that take place, it only bolsters the Russian support for the war effort that a country like this needs to be brought to heel and that it can't continue to exist on its border. And that's the situation that happens time and time again with Belgorod, with Bryansk was the other one, and now with Kursk also joins the ranks of the other two in terms of galvanized Russian support. And I don't know, maybe this was aimed to make them lose support in the Kremlin, aimed to make them lose support in Putin for allowing this to take place in the first place. And you can criticize a lot of the policies of the Kremlin, a lot of the policies of the MOD for maybe having too much red tape, like was said. But in the end, you're not going to get the Russians who have some sort of mass loss of confidence in the state, in which case allows you to secure some sort of bettering negotiating position. That's simply not going to happen. And any hope of that is really a fool's errand. But that's all I have on Kursk for now. And I'll move on. I'll wrap up our Ukraine news in short order here and move on to some of the other stories, particularly out of the Middle East this week. A little bit in Europe first, and of course some domestic news. And I'll try to make some sense of the economic news out of Japan that rippled over into the world markets. Even though a lot of that's still up in the air, it seems like the market has largely corrected. But I think it's too soon to say we're out of the woods, and that we'll just have to wait and see. But let's check in on Budanov, who is, of course, chief of Ukrainian intelligence, and some of his statements um, and antics over the past week. So there was a celebration for the Russian Navy in St. Petersburg, and the ceremony was attended by Putin and Defense Minister Belousov. Allegedly, there was a plot to assassinate both of them by Ukrainian intelligence. And there was a pretty intense phone call between the Pentagon and the Ukrainian defense establishment, particularly Budanov, in order to call out this operation, saying the Pentagon warning Budanov not to go forward with the quote-unquote act of terror he was going to commit. And they successfully talked him out of that. For all we know, that was just a fake. That was just a hoax. But, I mean, I believe that Budanov has been monomaniacal about assassinating Putin, that he has made it his mission in life to make sure that Putin is assassinated on his watch in order to further Ukraine's goals, which one has to ask, what would be the ultimate fallout of that if Ukraine actually did assassinate Putin? And once again, square that with Zelensky's comments, which teased the idea of some sort of peace talks before the end of the year. And look, I know how these things work, but to the public eye, what does that look like? It doesn't look good. Not at all. But moving on to some of his other grand plans in order to finally bring about the end of Putler's regime, he announced preparations for attack on the Crimean Bridge, confident that he can destroy the Crimean Bridge this time in the next few months. Once again, the Ukrainians have been trying to destroy the bridge over the Kerch Strait from the Russian mainland into Crimea since late 2022. Since the success of the 2022 counteroffensive, the Ukrainians have been monomaniacally focused in many ways on destroying the Kerch Strait Bridge, in which they haven't succeeded. They've managed to shut it down. They've managed to partially shut it down for a short time, but it's back in operation. And once again, even if they did succeed, which these days is mostly civilian traffic, you have a land corridor that connects Crimea to mainland Russia through the annexed oblasts. The Russians control those highways. The Russians control those railways. There's no real partisan activity to speak of that would sabotage that. They have more or less control of the Black Sea. I know that there have been some Ukrainian strikes in the Black Sea that they have managed to punch back, and particularly in coordination with the Royal Navy. But they have large control of the Black Sea. They have complete control over the Sea of Azov, and not to mention air power. The Russians have air superiority. They can fly supplies in. Crimea, as it stands now, is not in any danger of being cut off. It has been secured, which even if the Russians were to sue for peace tomorrow, freeze the conflict with the current borders, if that agreement were to be reached, once again, at the very least, they've secured Crimea. Now, I think for the cost Russia has paid, both in terms of manpower, money, and equipment, it would not be a satisfactory conclusion for the Russians that they would expect more concessions from Ukraine as a result of the price that they've paid in this war. But point being is, at the very least, the Sea of Azov and a land bridge to Crimea have been secured. So they're not going to cut off the peninsula, and this is just, once again, Budanov clamoring to commit an act of terror. And now, with his obsession on Crimea, I'm sure we'll all be partying in Mariupol and Crimea by summer 2025. Trust us, this time, it's going to be this summer where we have the Crimean beach party. Trust us, it can't go wrong if you just give us another $30 billion dollars for our next offensive. And probably in the ultimate act of delusion, Budanov says that it's easier to recapture Crimea than Donbass. So his quote says, "There are two entry points to Crimea from the Russian side and from ours, which the Russians control. The Crimean Bridge and the land isthmus. The question of recapture is our frontline operations from the Russian side by destroying communication from ours by applying pressure, and then that's it. Crimea is isolated. I say that we enter Crimea, and we are already entering there, he assures." So, once again, going back to his idea of the Kursk Bridge, destroy the Kursk Bridge, cut off contact from there, make an offensive in the south, push towards Crimea. Funny enough, sort of what uh, Arestovich considered. His name escaped me for a moment, excuse me. But sort of what Arestovich considered in terms of Ukraine's viable path forward. But once again, it's the Ukrainians on the southern front are not anywhere close to Crimea. Nor do they have the manpower and resources, especially in the southern front, to even push that. Nor are they amassing those forces. And watch out for those alleged 90,000 Russian troops gathering in Zaporozhye. They could very easily be redirected in order to counterattack. So you gotta watch out for those. But moving on to our last story out of Ukraine, which is a bit less serious, but I think tells a story of what life has become in Ukraine. So, from the New York Times headline, "War Shatters Dating Scene for Women in Ukraine." Subtitle, "While the pursuit of love might seem secondary to dealing with the horrors and privations of war, many Ukrainians say they need romantic relationships to help them cope." So, between the men deployed and the men who have died in the war, the women just can't live without men. And it is amazing, the inversion of narratives here. The past 50 years of the narrative of sexual liberation, relationships aren't needed, marriage is not needed, but the minute push comes to shove, the minute there is a legitimate shortage of men, women are languishing because of the lack of the dating scene. Now, I thought we were progressive. I thought we lived in the world of the 21st century. Why can't the women date each other? Why can't the women identify as men and have their men that way? But if jokes aside, point being, not to downplay the massive loss of life in Ukraine and the fleeing of young men and the more or less forcing of young men underground, unable to participate in society, this does show just a breakdown of society on a basic level. And we're talking about a country that already has low birth rates. I mean, I think the birth rate question is a little bit misconstrued in most discussions of it, but we're talking about a country that is, especially at this point, demographically in dire straits, and there's not really much they can do. And one of the most basic tenets of social life is broken down in the country, and I don't know, will the lonely women of Kiev take to the street and force Zelensky to end the war so they can get their men back? Or I don't know, maybe they'll import some new Ukrainians in order to fill that void, because we're all just interchangeable parts. Or perhaps they'll go west. Perhaps they will return to the time-honored post-Soviet tradition of mail-order brides. Like I said, not to make too much light of this, it does show just how much Ukrainian society is broken down, where, yeah, you can laugh at this headline, and I do think it's pretty ridiculous, especially the way they frame it, but we are talking about a lost generation in Ukraine. We are talking about a generation of men erased from history by this war, whether it be from this war or from fleeing the country. Regardless, one way or another, a generation of Ukrainian men in Ukraine functionally no longer exists. And while you can, like I said, make jokes about that headline, they do write in a way that is worthy of mockery. There's no real way you can spin it that doesn't paint a much darker picture than one would hope. And I mean, I hope this war ends tomorrow. And I understand, especially from the Russian side, and I know that a lot of people listening to this program probably do find themselves more on the side of the Russians. But I do hope this conflict freezes tomorrow. That this death stops, that this destruction stops, and that there is some sort of comprehensive peace that works out to bring about some sort of detente, not only in Europe but throughout the world, because the world is becoming increasingly more dangerous. The world is becoming increasingly more unstable, especially with the presence of nuclear weapons. Which, once again, I'll get into the stories about Israel in just a moment here, just a little bit here. Uh, it's needed more than ever because the more both of these conflict goes on, the larger risk of cataclysmic escalation there is. And I don't want to see that. And like I said, I can sympathize with a lot of people on both sides who say no, we can't end this war. It's not on our terms. But in the end, there has to be there has to be an end point, or else this is going to get out of control, and a lot more people are going to die. And I don't want to be alarmist. I don't want to say that we're on the brink of collapse, that collapse is imminent, but or that war is imminent, or however you want to term it. But something needs to be done, and I will forever commend Viktor Orban for being that seemingly sole voice of reason when it comes to that. And even the Chinese, love them or hate them, they do seem to understand as well that there needs to be some sort of de-escalation brokered in these major combat zones in order to have a functional world. Because you can criticize globalism, you can criticize global integration, but the genie is out of the bottle with a lot of those things, and that with that, it does rely on a relatively stable world where we can maintain those sort of trade relations, where we can maintain those sort of connections between countries. Now, should those be curtailed? Should some of those be torn up? Absolutely. But point being is, a lot of things are here to stay for the foreseeable future, and that if we don't sort these things out, then it is going to blow up in our faces, both figuratively and quite literally. But moving on to the UK before I move on to some other European news, because a lot has happened in the UK. I briefly touched on it last week, where after the murder of three girls in the UK, you by somebody who was from a Rwandan family, had lived in the country his entire life, second generation immigrant, that led to a sharp anti-migrant backlash, which does continue. Strangely enough, what it seems like, a lot of people are expecting this to be, because there's been isolated instances of these kind of things before, where this kind of thing will happen, and especially with the climate, the current conflict, a lot of people will say we need to crack down on Islamic immigration, we need to confront the problem of Islam, etc., etc., etc. And while there was that, obviously there was that, given this was a Rwandan, somebody who was ostensibly Christian, now, judging by the man's life beforehand, and certainly the event that kicked this all off, I don't think you could say he belonged to any religion in a real sense in terms of morality. You might say, oh, well, you can't just disown or disassociate from anyone who does wrong. But once again, when you start violating fundamental tenets, such as senselessly murdering people, I do think that in many ways you do sacrifice that religious identification. But regardless, like I said, this is somebody not from a Middle Eastern or Islamic background. This is somebody from an African background, which has led to just a whole wave of anti-migrant outrage, whether that be from people who come from the Indian subcontinent, from the Middle East certainly, and from Africa as well, where just a lot of pent-up anger in the British public, especially after years of this and a number of these crimes happening. I know a lot of people were bringing up, once again, the Rotherham crisis, where you had the grooming gangs operating there for a number of years, and I think it was something like 1,400 children, something like that, that were victims of that. And just a lot of these stories were getting relitigated. And it does seem that we did see the actual rare grassroots movement come up with this. Of course, it got violent, or as the media would put it under any other circumstances, fiery but mostly peaceful protests did take place. And it does look like things are stagnating, things aren't really getting more or less intense. Now you had the wonderful new Prime Minister Keir Starmer come out and talk about how we need to crack down on the far right extremists and the hatred and the bigotry in the country. You have this crime, once again, by somebody who is a second generation immigrant from Rwanda, and the Prime Minister who comes out, who touted himself and seemed to be in his first few weeks in office, once again, less than a month in office, who seemed to be in his first few weeks of office to return to some sort of sane center-left policy as opposed to the failure of the Conservatives and the failure of the more hard left wing of the Labour Party. And what did look like with some of his policy towards the migrant vote had just completely out the window. The idea of, normal, sane, moderate Keir Starmer completely out the window. And the nickname that's been going around as a result of his dress is Two-Tier Keir, because the way he described migrant crime, the way he described the riots and crime from the British population, he was far harsher about one than the other, and I'll let you guess which one that was. And I've not checked his popularity rating. I'm sure it's not looked good for him. Like I said, this man has been in office for just over a month, and the situation has already gotten out of hand. And there were some talks, I'm not sure how tongue-in-cheek it was and how serious it was, about him going on vacation amidst these riots. And I think ultimately what will happen is they're liable for a January 6th style crackdown on a lot of people who have taken to the streets in all of this. Because you have these people who, yes, were very angry and have endured years of out-of-control crime. Not just in the UK, but we see this all across Europe, and we're seeing this increasingly in North America as well. But with that, and look, you can say what they did is right or wrong. I'll hold my tongue here. I'm not going to endorse anything or denounce anything. I just want to talk about the story as is. But right or wrong, whatever. Point being is, they are going to take this situation and to live up to the two-tier Keir name. He is going to use everything in his disposal to throw the book at these people. He's going to have the courts and the British state is going to do everything they can to make sure these people never see the light of day again, because that is the system that they're living in. The other side, as always happens, will get a slap on the wrist. There'll be some key arrests, but point being is they're not going to see the end of this. And like I said, you can take whatever position you want on this, but point being is that is going to be the ultimate result of this. Unless this situation gets to a boiling point, unless these intensify enough where, who knows, he might resign, he might hand the reins over to his second in command in the party, or hell, if this situation gets bad enough, it goes along long enough, we could see a situation where it could force an election. I think the biggest movement that we've seen before this of this type was the Yellow Vest protests about 2018, I think it was. So that would have been about 6 years ago in France and continued throughout that year, end of 2018, beginning of 2019. And if I recall, although they became much less intense for the months that they went on, they weren't really shut down until the COVID lockdowns. So what we could see right here, at least a lot of what it reminded me of, it was very reminiscent of the Yellow Vest movement in France. Now, I know that fizzled out and that Macron, despite his immense unpopularity, still managed to cling on to power even in an election year, even when he was up for election after that. So that didn't really amount to any political change, but like I said, we'll see how intense this situation gets. We'll see what actually comes of it, how much outrage you actually get from the people, how organized these moves come, because so far, it is just disorganized discontent, and uh, judging by the current situation, it will probably stay that way for the time being. It doesn't really seem like there's somebody who's coming up as an organizer, which I understand that people would be hesitant to. Nobody wants to attach their name and face to this. You've had somebody like Farage who's tried to walk the fine line of this, where he doesn't want to outright denounce these people to the fullest extent because a lot of them are or were his voter base, and he also doesn't want to kowtow to the left because that destroys his entire position. So it's a fine line there, but like I said, I don't know how organized these protests will become. I don't know what the British state's response will be beyond just vaguely. I think it will be the British version of January 6th. Is really all I can put it as. And like I said, I'm not saying that they deserve it. I'm not saying they don't deserve it. I'm just trying to say, objectively looking at this, I think that will be the kind of response that the British state gives this. That anyone they can find, they will give that sort of treatment. And once again, we just have to objectively admit, compared to other riots in the recent past, especially, it is far harsher treatment than what we see from other groups that riot who come from a different political and ethnic and racial orientation. That's just the facts of it. You can say I'm wrong, you can say I'm biased, whatever, but no, it is just objectively the case that is how it works out. And like I said, it is still developing. It does seem to have lost some steam in the past few days, but if these do continue, if we do get consistent riots, how much force is the British state willing to apply to this? And what will the reaction of these different migrant groups be who make up significant amounts of the population within the UK? Will they? I mean, we've already seen a lot of crime come out of those communities in the past. Uh, will they return in kind? Will the situation continue to escalate further and further from this? And look, I don't think the UK, I don't think society is going to break down. I don't think you're going to see fights on the street, but who knows? You could get if the situation gets bad enough, and I think projecting way too far in the future on my part, but just generally speaking, a years of let style situation where something like this does happen. But like I said, a lot of that remains to be seen, and there's a lot of information to parse through. A lot of the dust has not settled yet when it comes to the situation in the UK, so there really is only so much you can say about all of this. But to move on from that, because I don't want to dwell on this for too long, I don't want to just repeat myself over and over. Just some news briefly out of Europe before I get into some more substantial Middle Eastern news. So, the EU has dismissed the concerns of Hungary and Slovakia, telling them to rely on LNG imports from Croatia in response to the situation with the closure of the Druzhba pipeline by the Ukrainians. And the Croatians, although you have Milanovic, who, up until Croatia actually adopted the euro, was very vocal, skeptic, I suppose we could say, not necessarily critic, but skeptic of Europe's policy towards Ukraine. He faded in the background quickly once Croatia adopted the euro at the beginning of 2023. He was an entertaining figure at the beginning of this war when it came to his commentary. He was up there with Arstovich when it came to the kind of comments he would make towards it. But Peter Zjarto said that Croatia is an unreliable transit country, and he dismissed their offer to be an alternative for imports of LNG, which would of course come through the sea, which would probably come through. I know there's a lot of U.S. LNG imports to Europe, not nearly enough, not cheap enough to make up for the losses from Europe, but that is the offer that was proposed. But I should also mention that the Turk Stream pipeline is still open, so they are still receiving some degree of energy from Russia. But once again, Druzhba, which was the main artery of oil to Central Europe, closed. Uh, and in response, you do have Hungary and Slovakia still considering to follow through with their threat of cutting off the power grid. So Hungary and Slovakia could be moving towards a major soft war, quote unquote, war with the Ukrainian energy industry. So, according to the figures here, about 40% of Ukraine's electricity imports pass through the Ukrainian-Hungarian border, which means Hungary is not entirely powerless in the face of Ukrainian blockade on oil supplies. And Hungary could be forced to cut electricity if its neighbor brings push to shove, which I would argue they have. And you have Oliver Horthy, who is head of climate energy policy department for one of the major energy companies in Hungary, who has said Ukraine's biggest energy problem is the electricity system. Since the start of the war, the country has lost three-quarters of its own electricity generation capacity, leading to Ukrainians having to deal with prolonged blackouts, cut to production due to a lack of electricity. And they, in order to deal with that, have began importing electricity from third-party countries, Hungary and Slovakia among them, particularly Hungary. So that is a back pocket dispute that they have. I know that Orban's government officials were saying Hungary had until September to resolve the crisis before its energy crisis. So I imagine that the Hungarians are probably going to be conciliatory until that point, and then when September comes around, if they actually live up to their word, they'll cut the power then, and they'll bring that they'll bring the situation to an even playing field, so to speak. Or who knows? They could be waiting for a particularly bad development in terms of Ukrainian politics or on the front line in order to employ this leverage. But given how renegade Hungary has been, in a good way, in my opinion, in the past 2.5 years, I wouldn't be surprised if they actually follow through with this cutting off electricity. If this would have happened maybe 2 years ago, I would have said they'll never do that. It's just bluff. Hungary has to keep itself in the good graces of the West enough. It has to walk the tightrope enough. But the West has been isolating Hungary more and more, has been pushing it towards Russia, towards China, towards alternative blocks of power, to the point where even the steadfast pro-Israel position previously held by the Fidesz government gave way to some interesting developments with Iran that I'll get into when we talk about the Middle East here. But on top of all of this, while the EU is telling the Hungarians to fend for themselves on the issue of the Druzhba pipeline, the EU itself is still wedded to Russian gas, and imports are the highest that they've been in 2 years since the beginning of the full-scale war, the special military operation the Russians would call it, in Ukraine, where they had initially cut that off. And with that, you have the EU claiming that we have to honor our contracts. We have to see these contracts through. So that's why we're reporting more or Russian LNG. Now, I know that you've had countries like Poland and the Baltic states who have tried to cut themselves off. But once again, the EU continuing through with these contracts and saying that they have to honor them. We still need the Russian LNG, which is the cheap source of fuel. So I guess in the back doorway, they really still are, quote unquote, fueling the Russian war effort. But there was some interesting data from Bloomberg and Business Insider regarding the attempts to shift away from LNG and to shift away from particularly Russian LNG, but also disputes as U.S. energy interests seem to shift towards Asia Pacific. So, to quote from these two articles, Europe cannot do without Russian natural gas. The latest statistics show the U.S. is attempting to replace Russian pipeline gas supplies to Europe with its own LNG, liquefied natural gas, and that plan has failed. So, with sanctions on the Russian energy industry from early 2022, the share of U.S. LNG in Europe has initially increased, however, later declined as higher prices from Asian buyers redirect LNG to the Pacific instead of the Atlantic. And now you'll see the U.S. face renewed LNG competition from Russia, which Russia's share of the EU gas consumption rose from 4% to 6% in 2024, and just the month of August. So, at the end of July, Europe imported 1.5 metric tons of LNG from the U.S., just slightly more than the 1.3 million tons that it imported from Russia in the same period, and those figures from Business Insider, who cite the U.S. Department of Energy. Which, mind you, energy production is still down in the U.S. compared to what it was during the Trump era. And even with Trump era numbers in terms of energy production, it still doesn't match both the number and the efficiency that can be provided to Europe. The U.S. does sit on a large reserve of natural gas, once again. A lot of customers, a lot of domestic use for that as well. So, continuing on to quote from Bloomberg, The gap between the two countries' LNG deliveries in Western Europe shrank in July to the narrowest since late 2021, according to preliminary ship tracking data compiled by Bloomberg. And mind you, this was one of Trump's big sticking points back during his presidency. He was very opposed to Nord Stream 2 because he wanted to replace Russian LNG imports in Europe with American LNG imports. He wanted to break into the European energy market. Although, with the ports, with shipping overseas versus pipeline, it does become far more expensive of an operation to get LNG to Europe via the Atlantic versus via Russia. And like I said, you've already seen this shift towards the U.S. And assuming Trump gets back into office and looking at his policy, I don't think that Trump could turn down the higher prices that they're paying in Asia for LNG unless this Japanese economic crisis does continue, unless, I don't know, there's some major reversal from the correction in the market and the economies of East Asia just fall into a complete recession. The Europeans might pay a higher price. But as it seems right now, it looks like the Russians have broken back through into Europe, and in which case, especially as the war effort in Ukraine does grow more and more severe, there may be reconsideration of some of these sanctions packages. And with that, I mean, the European Commission itself did give its tacit endorsement of the Ukrainian operation in the Kursk region, which is at the hub of one of the gas pipelines. I mean, but the original thought in all of this, from the Atlanticist elite in Europe, was we crush Russia, and for their either reparations or a new regime, the Russians will have to kowtow to our energy interests, and that we'll get the favorable end of the deal. But as it stands now, they are more or less paying more for the same energy that they bought before the war, and that this policy has just been complete economic nightmare for Europe. And in this global reshuffling, and as I'll get into some of the stories later, they continue to be the biggest losers in all of this. And in many ways, it's not even their fault, just because of the way that the post-war system is aligned, that their wagons are so hitched to the foreign policy of Washington, they really have no other choice to go along with this. Now, if we look at this, the goal to eliminate reliance on Russian gas is just infeasible for Europe. And it's just the simplest option in terms of geography, in terms of stability. It's just much easier to pipe it in from Russia than even pipe it in from the Middle East with how much conflict goes on there. And mind you, a large part of the war in Syria had to do with pipelines and had to do with the Qatari plans for a pipeline. And who knows, had Syria gone a little bit different, we could be looking at a different energy situation in Europe today. But once again, we're talking about Russia, the country with the largest natural reserves of natural gas in the world. With that proximity and with a pre-existing pipeline infrastructure that pipes it right in. And as far as I'm aware, Nord Stream is still repairable. The Nord Stream pipelines, you can still recover from the damage with those, and that those can be put back online in relatively short order, not quickly by any means. But on top of that, you have U.S. energy companies that are very mercenary about this, because energy sales, particularly with oil and gas, are just as much of a political weapon as an economic weapon. And it has been the choice of Washington, who want to try to create this form of NATO solidarity in the face of Russian aggression, who at the same time undercut their own policy by selling their LNG to the larger market in Asia. And I don't know, perhaps that's a way to shift priorities to Asia to make them more dependent on them to take care of the Chinese issue. But once again, the Chinese are buying LNG from the Russians as well. But once again, they chose the economic motive over the political motive, which, yeah, in a vacuum makes sense, but you can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't continue on with this policy of NATO solidarity. NATO is more united than ever. We need to stand together against a united Russian front. And at the same time, we're going to screw you out of the gas that you promised that you had to cut yourself off from Russia in order to form this defensive wall in the face of the invasion of Ukraine. It just falls apart. And with that being said, Borrell has had his own pivot to Asia, pivot to Central Asia. However, much like the Obama era pivot to Asia, it was none too successful. So just a brief report on Borrell's trip to Central Asia on his, well, not his trip to Central Asia, but his overtures to Central Asia, to say that it seems like his outreaches diplomatically have not really convinced Central Asia to snake on Russia, and that Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan are still solidly partners of the Russian Federation. I know that at least Kyrgyzstan, I believe, still hosts Russian forces. I think they still have some small degree of Russian troops there. I think Kazakhstan has seen away with all of that. And I know because of rising ethnic tensions, a lot of ethnic Russians have repatriated from Kazakhstan to Russia proper. But Borrell did actually visit two Central Asian nations. He'd visit the two Central Asian nations from August 1st to August 3rd in order to pry them away from Russia. And in he said, in regards to Kazakhstan, he aims to weaken the ties between Astana and Moscow, which are deeply rooted, spanning from the Baikonur Cosmodrome to the common membership of the Commonwealth and states, the SCO, the Eurasian Economic Union, and the Collective Security Treaty Organization. Um, to quote, in my opinion, the relationship between the two countries is too strong to be severed, and it's unlikely that Kazakh leadership will shift from the alliance with Russia into an alliance with Western powers. And this is also at the same time you have the U.S. suspending uranium imports from Kazakhstan. And mind you, Kazakhstan sits on one of the largest uranium mines in the world. And one of the speculated goals in all of this, Kazakhstan, who, since the fall of the Soviet Union, has played both sides, would be the new source of uranium because, once again, the Europeans are also very reliant on the Russians for uranium, plutonium, and other fuel for their nuclear power plants. That Rosatom does dominate the global nuclear industry. They have the sector cornered. And even within the European markets, and part of the sanctions packages has included several exemptions for them, particularly for Hungary and France, both of which are nations that have invested heavily in nuclear power, that they still, once again, import from Rosatom, and that Kazakhstan is not coughing up uranium under the terms that it would like. And I actually don't know off the top of my head. It might be the case. I would imagine Rosatom is invested heavily in Kazakhstan, has control over a non-insignificant amount of their uranium reserves. But to continue on with his comments about Kyrgyzstan, it's quite impossible that the executive of Bishkek will switch alliances, he argued, highlighting Kyrgyzstan resulted in significant failure of Western powers as the country was heavily funded by the U.S. aid program, the EU External Action, and other European nations like Switzerland in an attempt to install a Western-mirrored state in Central Asia. Brussels' efforts to target countries that play a pivotal role in the Russian neighboring policy are unlikely to gain traction, Marceli, who was one of Borrell's aides, reiterated. So, with all that being said, we do see this soft attempt to wrestle Central Asia away from Russian control, away from Russian influence, I should say. And it seems to fail time and time again. You'll recall, actually, a few months before the war started, a color revolution in Kazakhstan, which was very quickly suppressed by the intervention, both diplomatically and even some soft military power, by the Russian Federation that was completely shut down. And then you had the meeting of Putin and Xi Jinping in March 2023, which signed this compact with several other nations in order to clamp down on color revolutions and have a mechanism for preventing them from escalating further. So, the EU's attempt to undercut Russia when it comes to its dealings in Central Asia has completely imploded. Now, quite the contrary, many Russian third-party trading with Europe goes through Kyrgyzstan. Germany wants something from Russia, they get it through Kyrgyzstan. A lot of trade is laundered through Central Asia and then brought into the European Union. That's one of the ways that sanctions have been evaded since before the start of this war, but especially since the start of this war, you do see trade being laundered through Central Asia, particularly Kyrgyzstan, where, once again, through a great deal of U.S. aid and European influence, they try to drag into the Western sphere to little avail. Now, moving on to some more significant news out of the Middle East, because that is the other bulk of the show, which I know we're pushing 2 hours already. I'll try to keep relatively short. I'll try to cover the stuff in the Middle East and then breeze through some of the other stuff. I might break it up into two parts or make an addendum video if I need to, but we'll see where the night takes us. So, just some brief updates in the Gaza Strip when it comes to military operations in the Gaza Strip. Israeli troops launched a series of attacks in various areas in the enclave's capital in northern Gaza. At the same time, a calm situation remained in the satellite towns north of Gaza. The situation south of the enclave involved the removal of rubble and the exhumation of bodies in the Al Qarar and Bani Shuleya, where IDF units recently carried out quote unquote counterterrorism operations. At the same time, Israeli militants launched artillery and airstrikes on Rafah once again. Some activity in the West Bank. Israeli security forces carried out another series of raids, detaining 35 residents of the Palestinian Authority over the day. Since the beginning of the year, since the beginning of the events on October 7th, total number of detainees has reached upwards of 10,000 people. And looking at the situation in Lebanon, the Secretary General of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, announced the beginning of a new stage of the conflict. After this, Hezbollah carried out shelling of Israeli territory. So, over the past week, you've had a number of strikes from Hezbollah, as well as the Iranian attacks that are supposed to be coming any day now. The Iranians have put them off and put them off. There's been warnings not to fly over Iranian airspace. The Egyptians and Jordanians have issued similar warnings. In fact, there are some pretty interesting maps of air traffic where the Middle East is untraversable in terms of airspace. European airlines are cut off from Russian airspace. So, in order to get to East Asia, you have these European flights having to go around Africa as if they were the early 16th century explorers, as if they were the late 15th century explorers, having to go around Africa in order to get to East Asia. Now, there are some exceptions. There are some airlines that will fly through Russian airspace. I imagine Turkey is a good transit way where you land in Turkey, change flights, change airlines, and are able to get there. But point being is, for major European airlines, it's just transatlantic flights and flights across the continent, and otherwise it's impossible to get to the other side of the world, impossible to make their flights to East Asia, with both Russian and Middle Eastern airspace being cut off. Europe once again proves to be the big losers in all of this, and like I said, I don't even mean this to rag on them, but the more and more events happen, the more and more pressure increases on Europe, and the much more raw deals that they get, which I think is genuinely a shame. But returning back to the situation in Israel, you have had thousands of Israelis flee from northern Israel into southern Israel, taking positions in bunkers, taking positions in much more fortified position, including allegedly the political elite of Israel, that Tel Aviv has seen mass exodus of people internally. Now, in terms of Israelis leaving the country, Ben Gurion Airport is continuing operations as usual with the amount of people who are able to get flights out. A lot of airlines from the West were doing their last runs to the Middle East as operations do continue. Of course, there was the strikes in Lebanon earlier this week that did halt a number of flights to the Middle East, and that you had the call for the evacuation of many citizens from Lebanon. Now this week you have the call for the evacuation of a lot of citizens from Iran, for those who still have their nationals in Iran. And it's just been a matter of waiting. After the Haniyeh assassination, the Iranians have vowed retaliation. They've even entertained delegations from Russia, including Sergei Shoigu, who is on the Russian Security Council, having been moved from his former Ministry of Defense position, who has pledged aid to Iran in the event of a larger escalation with Israel in terms of air defense system, missile systems, has vowed cooperation, has cautioned Israel against cooperation, and allegedly has also been counseling the Iranians to, quote-unquote, avoid civilian casualties in Israel. So it does look like the Russians are trying to play something of a de-escalatory role. I know that Israel and Russia have had a falling out since the beginning of the war in February of 2022. But relations between Israel and Russia have always been very love-hate between the two, where their interests, a lot of interests of particularly influential Russian nationals are tied up in Israel. So Russia hasn't had the hand to maybe take as firm a position as they should with Israel. Now, granted, a lot of these people have left for other countries since the outbreak of the war and the implementation of sanctions just for their own bottom line. I mean, mind you, I don't believe that, for example, Roman Abramovich is currently residing in Russia right now. I think he did end up going abroad, but you can correct me if I'm wrong there. But point being is a lot of influential Russian oligarchs with, let's just say, split loyalties have diversified their options, in which case that has removed a great degree of Israeli influence inside of Russia. I'm not saying it's completely gone, but a great degree of Israeli influence has been removed. And especially with the escalation against Syria and Iran, there has been far more harsh, intense relations with Russia as their interests begin to clash on a very real level. Now, inside of Israel, on that same note, we do have massive crowds are continuing to demonstrate against Netanyahu. There were mass rallies in Tel Aviv against the government, and demonstrators took to the street and they were demanding the resignation of Netanyahu's cabinet for failing to secure the release of the hostages. And there were clashes with police, and there is photo and video evidence of this, and they had escalated into more violent confrontation. And this is all with the looming threat of a potential Iranian counterattack in retaliation for the assassination of Haniyeh within Iranian territory. And of course, there's a lot of facts that are still up in the air about the Haniyeh assassination, what exactly happened, debates back and forth whether or not there was a planted explosive, whether there were fifth columnists. It does look more and more like that this was an inside job that wasn't necessarily, well, not an inside job, but there were on the ground people who conducted this versus a drone or missile strike, which was originally speculated, and that brings up questions of security holes within the Iranian state and fifth columnists within the Iranian state, which I think, once again, are all very valid reasons, and especially paired so closely with the untimely death of Raizi. Now, I still largely chalk up that the Raizi death was just a result of circumstance and not any sort of greater plot at hand. However, like I said, when you start to pair these events together, when these events start to happen in succession, you could say it's just generally the climate in the region is growing more tense. But I, it it reopens questions I thought were once resolved, such as the Raizi case with his death, especially with this all taking place during Pezeshkian's inauguration, and also the question of leadership in Hamas. So, with that, and the Iranians and Hamas, they've had history that goes back and forth because, of course, Haniyeh was actually very early in endorsing the revolutionaries in Syria. He was very closely aligned with the Free Syrian Army back towards the beginning of the war. Now, there was never a complete severing of relations with the Iranians, but there was a straining of the relations with the Iranians, and especially with the Syrians, who, for a while, did host Hamas delegations, and that was one of the places where they did have their leadership in exile. They relocated to Qatar. Hamas has always been linked in with the Muslim Brotherhood, so those ties only intensified. And then when revolution breaks out in Syria, Haniyeh and certain wings of Hamas are on the side of the revolutionaries in Syria, all while still maintaining some ties to both Hezbollah and the Iranians. For example, the 2014 war in Gaza, you still did have some Iranian aid making its way to Hamas to fight back against the Israelis at that time. So, like I said, it goes back and forth, but the new leader of Hamas, who is Yahya Sinwar, he's head of the political wing, and he was formerly head of the military wing in Gaza, but he, throughout that dispute, took a much more pro-Iranian and pro-Syrian stance during the rift that took place within the so-called axis of resistance. So he was one of the more conciliatory parties, and frankly, he's probably one of the more pro-Iranian parties in general, and will be much more cooperative with them, which also once again raises the question, was Haniyeh an inconvenience to them? Was he somebody that they wanted gone? I don't think I would go that far, but I could be convinced to believe that, especially the IRGC, there were some elements of the IRGC that could couldn't have any use for Hanier, and maybe took some, let's just say, more lackadaisical security measures, resulting in this. And with all of this, it leads up to the standoff between Iran and Israel right now, with the question of retaliation looming over everyone's head. Now, ultimately, the Iranians have teased these strikes. They have threatened them. They've issued no fly zones over their territory. They're saying air traffic should avoid it. No toms have been issued there. The Egyptian has in kind of issued their own. So have the Jordanians. Pretty much everyone in the region at this point has issued them to some degree uh, over some sort of time period. Now, some speculate that the Iranians are going to be very symbolic about this and are waiting until uh, one of the Jewish days of mourning over the destruction of the Second Temple. I believe that on the Jewish calendars commemorated around August 12th or August 13th, which is how that would translate to the current calendar. So some speculate that they're waiting for that just to rub salt in the wound for the symbolic value of it. Of course, the Iranians do have a habit of, when they make these attacks, striking on Friday evening throughout Saturday during the day, of course, when it is Shabbat in Israel, when many people are taking the day off, when especially the much more rigidly religious Israelis aren't doing anything, because, once again, following the Jewish law to a T, where it's no work under any circumstances. So some speculate that. But ultimately, the Iranians, they have time on their side, and you could say that they're blowing this window to retaliate against Israel. But they can also hang this over Israel's head. And I'm not saying the Iranian state is playing some sort of grand strategy here, that they have some sort of 40-step plan in order to bring Israel into capitulation. But point being is, this is something they can constantly hang over Israel's head, perhaps even as a negotiating tactic. And also, if we're to believe the alleged reports that Iran has, for the first time, announced, at least according to one of the members of the Iranian parliament, that Iran does possess nuclear weapons, which, I mean, for all we know, is a very real possibility. And it's not unreasonable to think that they have had them for years, and that it has been uh, just in open secret, where nobody wants to engage in harsher retaliation against the Iranians, because they actually do have the nuclear deterrent. And what has actually prevented a lot of conflict between Iran and Israel, at least directly speaking, is that mutually assured destruction. But like I said, that's all speculation. I don't want to entertain that too much. But the Iranians can continue to hang this over Israel's head, and I don't know. Perhaps they're waiting until the tension dies down, and then they're going to strike. However, there was an odd situation with Peter Szijjártó, the Hungarian foreign minister, where the Iranians conveyed to him that Iran was planning a strike on Israel, and had him convey that message to the Israelis as a third party in order to, I guess, follow some sort of stipulation of international law, announcing your intentions in that regard. Like I said, some sort of UN legal mumbo jumbo that we encounter with a lot of this. Uh, but like I said, this has been the build up to it. Of course, you have had Lindsey Graham introduce a bill that would authorize military intervention against the Iranians. In fact, an outright declaration of war if they were to strike Israel. Mind you, a country that we're not even treaty bound to in terms of an alliance. Our greatest ally we have no formal alliance with, mind you. And just to go briefly over the situation in the Middle East right now, Biden in a private meeting was reported to warn Netanyahu that if he escalates again, he can't count on the U.S. to bail him out. Israel said that they expect a much shorter early warning of Iranian attack as compared to the attacks on April 13th. Iran may launch missiles before drones, with minutes of warning instead of hours. If you remember the attacks back in April, it was a very slow process. The drones were in the air for hours. It gave the Israelis time to prepare for a response, in which case it looked like the Iranians were just saving face as a result of that, after the uh, embassy and the consular annex within Syria was blown up by the Israelis. The U.S. Navy has sent 12 warships and the aircraft USS Theodore Roosevelt to the Middle East, with about 4,000 Marines that are on board the vessel, and an underground bunker in Jerusalem where senior Israeli officials can remain for extended periods of war has been prepared according to local media outlets. Uh, and on top of this, there have been some strikes. There has been some skirmishes, particularly strikes on U.S. bases in Iraq and Syria, where it's reported that two members of the Georgia National Guard died on Wednesday in Iraq where they were stationed. And it's saying they were unrelated to non-combat deaths, is what they officially said. And then, of course, the Russian cargo planes have been flying to Iran with presumably carrying heavy hardware. And it's speculated once again by media outlets in the region, by Al Mayadeen in particular, that the Iranians will carry out a substantially more severe attack than on April 13th, and it will cross Israel's quote-unquote red lines, and Iran will seek to restore deterrence, even if it causes an all-out war. And a Qassam Brigade's commander, Haitham Balidi, was among the 9 killed in the Israeli attacks on Tulkarem, and that was from Middle Eastern Spectator. So it is really just a game of wait and see what's going to happen next. A lot of news about this is just pure speculation, and there's really not much more you can say about that. It's just a matter of, will the Iranians actually live up to what they said they're going to do? Are the Iranians actually going to return some sort of retaliation? And some people might say that they're blowing their credibility. Some people might say that they are going to make themselves look like fools in light of what happened with the assassination of a foreign emissary on their own soil, which, I mean, I can certainly see that. It's just a matter of how much of a reputational blow are the Iranians willing to take in order to bide their time? Are they willing to let themselves look weak in the moment in order to gain a greater advantage on Israel at a more opportune time? Or are they genuinely afraid that the Israelis are going to implement a figurative, if not literal, nuclear option? Which, as we all know, is very possible. And on top of all of that, there has been some recent actions by the Israelis, most recently in Syria, where the Israelis have dropped bombs near Shayrat Air Base in southern Syria, close to the border of Lebanon, which is used by both Russian and Iranian forces, as well as, of course, Syrian forces. And this was in the vicinity. They didn't actually hit the base, but once again, the Israelis are testing their limits there. They are probing there. And on top of news in Syria, something that was interesting that also ended up at least coinciding with Israel strikes. Now, perhaps these were related events, but there were pro-Assad locals in Deir ez-Zor province that did, by force, they took up arms with little to no blood spill. I don't think there was actually any fire exchange, but armed men did take back a village in Deir ez-Zor from the U.S.-backed SDF forces, and that they had driven them out of that part of Deir ez-Zor. So this wasn't an offensive by the Syrian government, but you do have pro-government forces on the ground. Now, I don't know, perhaps it was coordinated by state agents to make sure that happened, but who knows? We could speculate on that all day. But the Middle East is really just a case of wait and see. Everyone's biding their time. Everyone is looking for the right moment. Of course, Netanyahu will continue to act with impunity. One might argue that he wants to war with the Iranians to keep himself in power. And I know there were some speculations from some elements in Iran saying that they should assassinate Netanyahu in retaliation for Haniyeh, but I don't think that's going to happen. But perhaps the Iranians are just waiting out Netanyahu and waiting for him to fall out of power before they pursue any sort of escalation, because that once again would just solidify his goals and maintain him in power. And of course, striking at a time of domestic political disputes would be all the better for the Iranian goals in terms of the Israelis. And the IDF command, the IDF brass, is growing more and more frustrated with Netanyahu, with the apparent lack of progress in Gaza when it comes to the actual military operations against Hamas, where Gaza has been reduced to rubble, yet you still have Hamas forces mounting a successful guerrilla war against the IDF forces in the Gaza Strip. And I mean, that's not even to mention the protest case over the um, soldiers who were detained for the rape charges against Palestinian prisoners, which I did learn apparently those were towards other men. If you want to speculate on the details beyond that, I'm not going to outright say them because I think everyone knows what I'm getting at there. But it is just a matter of the Iranians. We're just waiting for them to act. It's they have initiative, and what will they do from here? But at the same time, the Iranians, compared to the Israelis at least, they have time on their side. They can wait this thing out. So we'll see what ultimately comes of that. Now, moving on from that, I'll go into some brief economic news regarding the chaos within the Japanese market and its ripple effects on global markets. So, I will fully admit, when it comes to a lot of the stuff to do with the stock trading, the markets, a lot of this stuff is just sorcery to me, so I'll make as much sense of it as I can. So, just in brief, explaining why the dip happened in the market, which did quickly correct because it dipped down 13% in Japan where this all started, and that had to do with their currency manipulation. It came back up 10% from Monday to Tuesday. So this is a report from Sputnik, which is once again a Russian media outlet, but I think the analysis is good and it warrants repeating here. So, political mismanagement of debt, politicized fact spending, and resulting inflation led to a serious market volatility, as in recent global market plummet, said Paul Goncharov, who is a veteran financial analyst, and he was giving an interview with Sputnik. So, one of the points here was just the decline of G7 economies in general. Neither the US, EU, nor Japanese economies are doing well. The US manufacturing sector has contracted for the fourth consecutive month in July, with the manufacturing PMI registering 46.8%, signaling technical recession, he said. So the Japanese benchmark Nikkei 225 stocks index plunged 12.4%, so about 13%, prompting a chain of share dumps as investors fretted over the state of the U.S. economy and fears of recession. The knee-jerk global market response triggered a grim report showing that unemployment in the U.S. had surged to reach 4.3%. So, point two has to do with the U.S. debt economy, which Goncharov had said the world's largest financial flow is based on debt, and the U.S. economy has long morphed into a debt economy. How do you attract new buyers to the U.S. debt? By increasing yields earned, which leads to all the problems. Though government bonds are assumed to be safe if their value experiences volatility because of politicized fiscal policy or extreme political tension, which we have both of right now, then those who borrow against it may be forced to sell, starting off a chain reaction, he noted. Of course, inflation is point number three right here, which prompts holders of government bonds to request a yield to compensate for the fact that when the bond was finally paid back, the money will not be worth what it was originally. And number four is the geopolitical cauldron in the Middle East regarding tensions there. So it could further feed into quote unquote crowded geo-economic and geopolitical cauldron, uh, forcing it to boil over. To quote Goranchov once again, we are witnessing a massive loss of trust among the international community as to the true intentions and goal of the U.S. government, which increases volatility and uncertainty. Mind you, this is at the same time when Biden is missing in action. He fell to what can only reasonably be called a coup, I think, is the only fair way to put it. With his soft removal from power, we haven't seen much of him since his dropping out of the race. There's been a few public appearances, and also there was his speech, but like I said, he has been pretty scarce lately, and that's on top of the amount of power he signed over to Blinken and Yellen, particularly on the issue of Ukraine. But I can only imagine that there's been other delegation of power behind the scenes. So this caused, of course, Japan being about 13 hours ahead of the East Coast U.S., caused a market sell-off, which led to the Nasdaq being down 1,000 points on Monday. The S&P 500 also took a nosedive from 550 to 5,550 to 5,178.92, uh, which represents over 500 stocks, and like I said, took a nosedive. You can go look at some of the graphics on that. It was harsh, and a lot of people were comparing this to Black Monday in, I believe that was 1987. And this is on top of course, just a past few weeks of certainty. So, just to read some reports from the stock market over about the past week. So, the U.S. NASDAQ 100 index, dominated by technology companies, has fallen more than 10% since its peak in mid-July. The Japanese Topics Index lost double digits and on August 2nd fell immediately by 6%, which is the worst day since 2016. As Britain's The Economist reports, panic gripped the markets, and Wall Street's fear gauge, the VIX index, which measured expected price movements, had soared to the highest level since America's regional banking crisis last year. I'm sure you remember the fallout of the Silicon Valley Bank and its cascading effects on other regional banks, which seems like a lifetime ago at this point. Also, wild moods reign in certain sectors. The index of semiconductor shares of companies producing chips fell. For example, the price of processing manufacturers, Intel and ARM, fell by 25 and 40% respectively. The assets that investors flee to when they panic, gold, the Japanese yen, and treasury bond, also falling. Gold fell by 2%. The Economist names three reasons for the collapse. Number one, inflated expectation of artificial intelligence. The biggest swing in U.S. stock prices came from five tech giants that are active in AI, which are Alphabet, Amazon, Apple, Meta, or Facebook, and Microsoft. The previous euphoria investors felt about everything related to artificial intelligence is evaporating. I'm sure those of you who have interacted with AI firsthand, even in the most trivial matters, realize that computers are far stupider than we first assume. AI, I don't think, is putting many of us out of work anytime soon. It is really just a glorified autocorrect, in my opinion. But perhaps I have too pessimistic an assessment on the situation. What followed was a domino effect on the chip and semiconductor manufacturers, who will lose some demand if AI investment falls. Separately, adding to the instability is Trump's statement that Taiwan, the large chip manufacturer, will have to defend itself from China. Also, Biden's plan to introduce new restrictions on the export of chips production equipment to China. Once again, China, one of the largest manufacturing hubs in the world. So, moving on from that, number two in the point from The Economist was slowing U.S. economic growth and weakening labor market. In America, on August 2nd, a report was released to which the unemployment rate rose to a three-year high of 4.3% in July, and the forecast for job growth failed, once again going back to the raising the unemployment rate. The risk of recession in the U.S. has increased. Some might say it's already there, and I remember there was a lot of debate over the terminology of a recession about a year ago in regards of, is the U.S. in a recession? Whatever. So going on to number three, the third factor is the fast strengthening of the Japanese yen in the last 2 decades, but after the central bank's decision to raise the discount rate, which automatically lowers the price of Japanese stocks, which many large Japanese corporations earn money abroad in foreign currencies, that is, foreign trade will go into the negative. This will force investors to sell off assets, which will increase instability both on the domestic and global markets. And then just some interesting points here that were also brought up is that just some brief history on that is the Bank of Japan kept interest rates at zero after their banking failure in the 90s. Most of the debt that caused the failure wasn't written off, but kept on their books. Not an issue with zero rates. The Bank of Japan increased rates last week for the first time, not going to affect above to reverse carry trade, for example, the cost of opening positions that pay interest rate daily. On top of that, the Bank of Japan anticipation sold off $39 billion of U.S. Treasuries a few weeks ago, red flagged the markets knew that Japan could be a trigger. Bank of Japan's largest holder of U.S. Treasury bonds outside the USA. BRICS countries also selling, flooding the market, destabilization, and reverse carry trade is the simple explanation that could trigger a global margin call and a global credit event. And once again, Europe coming out on the bottom of this. The Euro bond market is also potentially most exposed to a Bank of Japan failure. The leading to a collapse in the markets as investors rush to safer assets, the economic impact of such a collapse could be significant, affecting companies, consumers, and global financial markets, which are already heavily based in the derivative debt bubble. Now, what's interesting is what I saw from some of the market drops in China and Russia. It was only about 1.5% in China, whereas in Russia, excuse me, whereas in China, I believe it was. Let me see here. Um, the amount that it was about 2.6 in China, so negligible compared to, for example, the 13% that happened in Japan. So the BRICS countries did seem to be relatively insulated from the market chaos, and it does seem for the time being that we have staved off another economic crisis, that things for now have been put back into the bottle, but we'll see how long that really lasts. But ultimately, with the level of interdependence of global economies and the amount of international instability, as I was talking about at the beginning of the show, if there's not some sort of major global de escalation from all of the regional and, frankly, global power blocks, something is going to trigger a crisis at some point. It's just inevitability. I know that crises are always inevitable, but once again, we exponentially increase the risk of one and the severity of one the longer something like this continues. So it's just a matter of biding your time. But apparently, something I did think was interesting, just on the last note on this, people, quote unquote, buying the dip did help to shore up the market, according to reports that people who looked at this as an investment opportunity did help to stabilize the situation. Like I said, the situation has been more or less stable throughout the rest of the week. We'll see what next week delivers, and we'll see what the next few weeks deliver in those regards. But I just wanted to close out briefly with some domestic U.S. news. So, right now, according to the election betting odds, Kamala Harris is ever so slightly in the lead with a 50.7% chance of winning, according to the betting markets, with their predicted map putting the election at 270, 268 in Harris's favor, with states like Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, in terms of, like I said, odds versus polling, about neck and neck, about 50-50. For example, as the time of recording, Wisconsin is 51.7% chance to go to the Democrats, and Pennsylvania is 51.1% to go to the Democrats. Mind you, Trump, even without Nevada, his path to victory is Arizona, which I think he can pull off again. I think that, putting aside any questions of, let's just say, shenanigans in 2020, uh, is certainly in play for Trump, and had gone for Trump before. Arizona and one other Midwestern state, plus Ohio, which Ohio is solidly in that category. I don't think Georgia is flipping either. He can even lose Nevada. He just needs to pick up Wisconsin, Michigan, or Pennsylvania. And by contrast, Harris needs to win the entire former blue wall, unless she makes some great breakthrough in the Southwest. And I know the polling at this point has become closer, and internal polling versus public polling, there's a significant degree of departure between the two. But if we are talking about shenanigans, which certainly do not happen in U.S. elections, if we are talking about fortification, the election is certainly within fortification range with how they poll in some of these states. And Kamala Harris came out with her running mate, which is not Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro, who was allegedly a former IDF soldier, tried to join the IDF, spent 5 months in an auxiliary program, very steadfast supporter of Israel, which was very alienating to the base. Went with Tim Walz, who was governor of Minnesota during both the COVID crisis and during the Summer of Love riots of 2020. I'm sure you all remember very well. Who was actually either praised or criticized for his acquiescence to a lot of the ongoing strife in his state at the time. You can say whatever you will about him. I think his election makes little difference. He is the Democrat inverse of somebody like Mike Pence, where it's establishment party to the core, um, under the appearance of an inoffensive Midwestern governor. However, it just might be my personal bias speaking. I think Mike Pence played the part a bit more well, was able to play that off. And Tim Walz is supposed to be that reassuring moderate white guy that stands side by side with Kamala as she bumbles her way through the campaign. Uh, a lot of people on the left were seemingly very excited for him, but I feel like they could have put anyone on that second part of the ticket, and they would have towed the party line. The same sort of quote unquote excitement would still be there for him. But like I said, it, in my opinion, makes little difference. I think right now, despite the betting odds, just given what needs to happen within the election, an early call, I'm not going to make a definitive call, certainly not yet. In my opinion, Trump still has the advantage, especially considering the fact that there's a lot less establishment pushback on him this time. They've, as I've alluded to many times before, made their peace with him. And I think in light of the global economic scare that is going to affect this election in two very different ways, where a lot of people will remember the relative stability of the Trump era up until 2020, the pre-COVID Trump era, where, yeah, the stock market did do relatively well. Now, did that necessarily translate to the kind of economic revival promised by Trump? No, it certainly didn't. But people did remember it as a much more stable time. Number two is, depending on how arrayed these forces are, and I know that in the U.S. maybe, but abroad is a different case, where in anticipation for some sort of looming economic crisis, it's beneficial to have Trump in there and have him take the fall for these things. Much like I've been saying with the situation in Ukraine, that Trump wins in 2025. In my opinion, I can see where a lot of the administrative state lets certain projects fail, like Ukraine, and like the ongoing economic crisis or the potential economic crisis, let that fall on Trump's shoulders, point the finger at him, and say, you could have prevented this if you just voted for Brandon, if you just sucked it up and voted for Kamala. Or, hell, if they want to be really petty, they can say, if you just voted for Hillary Clinton, bring that line back up ad nauseum. So, I don't think Tim Wells, I almost called him Tim Kaine, who was Hillary's running mate. At this point, it might as well have been Tim Kaine. Is that much of an impact one way or another? I think it'll be business as usual in terms of the election cycle. Allegedly, Trump and Kamala have agreed to 3 different debates in September, hosted by each of the major news networks, Fox, NBC, and CNN. Or maybe it was ABC, I can't remember. The point being is 3 major news networks. So what will actually come of those, who knows? Like I said, I can't really find myself getting that excited for Trump, but I sure as hell have no love for Kamala. So I find myself in a pretty detached position, and my tentative prediction for the election now is as we get closer to election season, as we actually see the debates, as the window closes, my opinion could change. But as it stands now, I think Trump has it more or less in the bag. I think it's going to be a narrow victory. I could see it just being Wisconsin, Nevada, and Arizona that put him across the line, or even just Arizona and Wisconsin that put him across the line, which just gives him 272 in the Electoral College versus the required 270. Like I said, very narrow victory compared to his first victory, which was 306 in the Electoral College. And will he win the popular vote? I don't know. I think this is going to be an election largely of discontent, an election with pretty low turnout. It's just going to be the people who are dedicated on both sides who really turn out. And the question is, who can gin up more voter energy? I know there's a lot of alleged energy behind Kamala, but I have yet to see it. Whereas Trump, say what you will about him, love him, hate him, still does have the core of his base marching lockstep behind him. So we'll just ultimately have to see, but I have a hard time believing that Kamala is going to win, and I don't want to get too conspiratorial, but I think it is reasonable that she was set up to fail and that she was set up to take the fall and take the L for the Democrats so they can regroup in 2028 under somebody, I don't know, maybe like a Gavin Newsom or whatever, who can actually win a national election and can actually speak to a crowd and uh, speak the language of the people, or at least pretend to speak the language of the people. But that's ultimately all I had for this episode of the War Report. We'll see you guys next time, and goodbye.